Did you go log into it?
Right.
Yeah.
10 o'clock, right?
Yeah, but I don't see anybody coming in. Oh, here's someone.
Don't worry, I'll be there. 9 o'clock yet.
Welcome to the conference.
You need a link again.
Not really easily. Here. Did you register?
Yeah.
Welcome, everybody. We'll be getting started in a few minutes. Good morning, Amber.
Good morning.
How are you doing?
I'm fine, thank you. How are you?
Doing okay. We'll see how it goes. Hopefully, I'm saying that throughout the morning, but
I understand. You may need to switch me from panelist to co-host because right now my video is turned off and I cannot turn it on.
okay. There you go. Morning, Marlene. Yep, I see you, Amber.
Great.
I think you see my screen with the introductory page. Is that what you're looking at?
Yes,
Okay,
I am.
we're gonna have, I can show to the next slide. Julie Schneider is going to kick us off.
Okay.
I made it. I think we're supposed to put the questions in the Q&A. Yeah, not chat. Okay. I think if we put it in the chat, not everybody can see it. So the questions need to go into the Q&A. I'm gonna open up that. Yep.
I've dealt with that. It helps too if you want to keep a history of questions and answers. Maybe you know this, but you can run a report later.
Yeah.
And print those out if you need to, or save them.
Yeah, we do that and then we follow up if the questions aren't answered.
Mm-hmm.
Morning, Warren. Morning, everybody.
Me.
Yeah. I'm
Okay,
ready.
so Oh, okay, so this is the format you was telling us about. No one can see each other, but everyone can see you.
Correct.
Okay,
I would, I want to make sure Julie can have her video if she'd like to do that.
she may want to.
Okay. I
Thank
don't know
you.
if you guys were together or separate this morning.
Thank you.
And we do have a call-in listener. That's pretty good. So I'm glad that's working out.
Okay, so can you unmute me or
Yeah, you're unmuted right now.
I am?
Oh, yeah.
So I'm only talking to you directly.
No, I think you're talking to, I could be
Everyone?
wrong. Amber, she's talking to everybody, correct?
We can all hear you, Marlene.
Yeah, Marley can hear you and see you.
Uh-huh.
So welcome.
So when we start, you're gonna
Yeah.
cut everyone off.
Correct. Yeah,
Okay.
they'll be off until they're made a panelist. That's the way it works. So.
Everyone but the three of us, I think at this point, is muted.
Okay. So how would I know if I'm muted?
Right now.
Can you see yourself on video on your screen?
You thought you're asking me?
I'm asking Marlene.
Oh, I don't know if you can.
What you guys there? How do you want me to dump questions?
I only see Amber and Steve.
Okay, maybe at the bottom of your screen, is there a toolbar with options like stop video or mute? There's a little microphone icon. And when you are
No.
muted, no,
It says
I don't
chat,
know.
lower hand, Q&A. So I think that was Warren's question, that he doesn't see the mute button, so.
Okay. And we see different things as attendees or panelists.
Okay,
I'm
so
not
as I have
sure.
questions, you will unmute, okay.
There's every attendee, sorry, Steve, stop me if I'm talking over you. Every attendee should at the bottom of their screen or somewhere have a Q&A icon. So lots of
Yes.
people have used the chat to say good morning, but
Okay.
when you have questions, I think Steve prefers everyone to use the Q&A.
Okay, so make sure you announce that when you doing questions, put it in Q&A and not the chat.
Yes.
Okay. All right.
Yep, that's in me. I'm looking
All right.
for Julie. Okay, Julie's here.
Okay. Well, good morning, all. All will be well today.
I'm not sure. Julie should be able to. Julie, you should be as panelist now. Try one more time here. Julie, are you able to speak? I hope so.
Steve, on my end, I only see 3 panelists.
Yeah,
Myself, okay.
For some reason I'm promoting her, but it's not there now finally. She's cool. He's here and okay, Julie,
Yeah, I am. I'm here. Great.
welcome.
Great. How are you doing? How,
Pretty good.
hope everyone is doing well this morning. Are we ready to begin?
Yeah, let's begin with our Disability Rights and Housing Conference. And hopefully you can see my screen here. We're going to start off with an introduction by Julie Schneider. She's the Director of Detroit's Housing and Revitalization Department, HRD, as we all call it. Julie, welcome. Good morning.
Good morning. Thank you so much for inviting me here to give a little intro. So this is really, I think, an important topic to be discussing. So I'm the director of the City of Detroit's Housing and Revitalization Department. And so the City of Detroit's Housing and Revitalization Department, or HRD, as we call ourselves, we're responsible for administering federal housing and community development dollars. So that is known as CDBG or HOME. And we do, with those dollars, we invest in affordable housing, we invest in community development, community organizations, invest in home repair, as well as we do work in housing policy in the city, helping to develop the pipeline of affordable housing in the city. And so housing is the place where everyone you wake up from, you start your day from, you end your day. And so it's just so important to a person's life, and housing stability and feeling comfortable in your own home, that house serves your needs, is just critically important. And so today, I believe you're going to hear about you're going to talk about accessible housing and construction requirements, and then you're going to talk about disability rights in housing in a little bit later today. And so the program is really put together in this way so that we could cover two really important facets of disability rights in housing. And so I hope you're able to enjoy the entire presentation today with Amber Fagan and Sara Pratt speaking to you today. Actually, when I worked before working at the City of Detroit, I worked at the Department of Housing and Urban Development, and I was earlier on in my career, and Sara Pratt was I believe the Assistant Secretary for Fair Housing and Equal Opportunity. And I remember sitting in many meetings in the back, because I was pretty new to the department, and I was always just really impressed by her lifelong work in this field. And so between her and Amber, who has also been really committed to this to design and construction accessibility requirements in her career, I think you have a really strong presentation today, and we'll all learn a great deal. So glad you're able to join us today. I don't want to take too much more time. I know I have 9 to 9:05, and it's 9:07. So want to keep the day on time as we get to the content, which is really the most important part of the presentation. So with that, I believe I'm turning it over to Amber, or is it going back to you, Steve?
I'm going to talk about a few of the ground rules, and then we'll send it over to Amber real quick. Thank you so much. And as Julie kind of mentioned it's been my experience. I've been in this position here since August of 2018, and I've found the city of Detroit very, very committed to disability rights, and that extends not only to accessible housing, but to make sure that people receive reasonable accommodations and modifications, sort of open up housing to people with disabilities until Detroit, like other cities, is able to rebuild its housing stock, because we just have a nationwide shortage of housing, particularly for low-income people and people with disabilities. So it's nice to see that commitment. That commitment runs all the way up to the top, to the mayor. And so good for the city, and I think they're going to accomplish a lot of great things. But let me go through the ground rules real quick. Hopefully, I think can you see the ground rules? The conference is being recorded. Make sure you get questions, put them into the Q&A, not the chat. Real important. It's a tendency for people to write things in the chat. They will not be picked up as questions. We will only be looking at the chat. So please make sure you do that. We've got people available to pick up the questions from the chat. so that our presenters, Amber and Sarah, will be able to receive those questions. And again, too, just a caution that this webinar provides general information. It's not intended to be legal advice. There's, if you need that kind of assistance, that you obviously there have to be a lot more discussed before people can give you that kind of advice. If you need to, you can call our office or CREO, Detroit CREO Department. You see the number there, Detroit for Civil Rights, Inclusion, and Opportunity Office. They can answer your questions and provide more detailed assistance as needed. So without going any further, we're going to start now with Amber Fagan, just real briefly. We could spend all day talking about Amber and Sara, so we'll just do it. She is an accessibility specialist for LCM Architects in Chicago. And the real critical thing is for the last 10 years, she's managed HUD's Fair Housing Accessibility First program. And if you type that in, Fair Housing Accessibility First, you'll be amazed at the kind of information that's there. Practical guidance on disability, the Fair Housing Act design and construction requirements, whether it's light switches, bathrooms, I mean, whatever you want to know about in terms of accessibility requirements, it's in the Accessibility First program. Amber would also manage the question and answer. Anybody could call Fair Housing Accessibility First and be routed to Amber. And it's amazing what a resource that she has been for so many years. Great communicator. And she's going to go on and explain the Fair Housing Act basic design and construction requirements. And she's going to hopefully hit on some of the things, common violations that people experience. So Amber, would you like to share your screen and get started? Welcome.
Thank you. I'm ready. And I see a little message that says if I screen share, it will stop your screen sharing. So here we go. You'll see mine. And it should be this one. Need to start my slideshow. My toolbar covered up where I start my slideshow. Bear with me.
Okay, how are you?
Okay, can everyone see my screen and my pointer? Hopefully, because everyone's muted. All right, this is a lot of information to pack into an hour. So I will do my best to cover these design and construction requirements under the Fair Housing Act, as well as some common violations. I see that we have one question already, and I'd like to address that in terms of my own presentation. I cannot speak for Sarah's later, but I'll be going over the design and construction requirements that fall under the Federal Fair Housing Act, which can apply to a myriad of housing, whether it be affordable or we might be meaning federally funded or not. And I just unfortunately don't have time to get into the additional layers that apply in terms of design when multifamily housing is HUD or federally funded. But there is another layer. In short, for now, I'll say that law is called Section 504, and there are other design requirements that apply to federally funded housing. So I think I have to tap my screen to progress. There we go. We will be discussing the Fair Housing Act's design and construction requirements today. Multifamily housing, I think I'm going to take this moment to hide myself. You don't need to see me. You want to see my screen. There we go. Okay. Hopefully everyone can see my screen. And the design and construction requirements under the Federal Fair Housing Act apply to what the law calls covered multifamily dwellings. These are designed and constructed for first occupancy after March 13th of 1991. This applies to the interior of these dwelling units, and it applies also to the public and common use areas of these multifamily dwelling projects. I stressed here that the design requirements apply to multifamily dwellings built for first occupancy after March 13th of 1991. If a building existed before March 13th of 1991, it would not have been subject to these design requirements when it was first constructed. Or
Oh,
if a building is first constructed after 1991, I'm sorry, before 1991, but it undergoes renovations after 1991, the Fair Housing Act does not have a section that requires compliance and alterations of existing buildings. That would be a difference in Section 504 for federally funded housing. Those existing buildings undergoing alterations would still have some requirements. But under the Fair Housing Act, it's designed and constructed for its first ever occupancy after March 13th of 1991. What are these buildings? What is a covered multifamily dwelling? It is a building with 4 or more dwelling units. Just full stop, that's it. If it's a building and it has 4 or more dwelling units in it, we need to consider it a covered multifamily dwelling for purposes of the Fair Housing Act. And then we need to know how many of the units in this covered dwelling are required to comply. If this building has an elevator, all of the units will be subject to these requirements. If the building does not have an elevator, then what the law calls the ground floor dwelling units will be subject to these requirements. So it isn't a minimum percent. It isn't a ratio based on a certain number and then it kicks in a minimum number. If this structure has 4 or more units, then we have to look at the Fair Housing Act. It could be a high rise with an elevator. Every single unit is covered. Or it could be a walk-up building. This law does not require the presence of an elevator. So it could be a walk-up building, and that would make the ground floor units required to comply. The types of housing subject to these design and construction requirements are far-reaching. Again, could be walk-up apartments, but they could be for sale. This could be a condominium building. It does not have to be rented only. It could be public housing. 4 or more units after March 13th of 1991. This law is not dependent on federal funding, whether it's a public or a private entity. It is applying to public housing, private housing, for rent housing, for sale housing. It could be student dormitories. It could be homeless shelters. We have 4 or more units. We need to look at these design requirements. Some housing is not covered. I can't stress enough, buildings with 4 or more units. So if these are detached single-family homes, it could be a brand new development that consists of 500 detached single-family homes. They will not be subject to these design requirements. Duplexes or triplexes, those terms can change meaning geographically or regionally, I'll say. A duplex or a triplex, what we're meaning here is a building with less than 4 units. Maybe it's a duplex, that's 2 units. Maybe it's a triplex, that's 3. If it's less than 4 in that building, it will not be subject to the requirements. Multi-story townhouses, or really I prefer to say multi-story dwelling units, are not subject to these requirements unless they're in a building with an elevator, because every unit in a building with an elevator is subject to the requirements. So if we're looking at multi-story dwelling units in a building with an elevator, then HUD requires that the elevator serve the primary entry level to the unit, and that primary entry level is what is required to comply, not the other levels in this multi-story dwelling unit. So that primary entry level covered by the elevator must comply with the 7 design requirements that we'll be getting into. It must include a compliant bathroom or powder room from those requirements, and it must include a compliant kitchen at that level. So multi-story townhouses, multi-story units, and non-elevator buildings are not required to comply. We just went over if they are in buildings with common elevators. Also, multi-story townhouses or units that have private elevators in the unit that unit with the private elevator would be required to comply. If it's not a common elevator, it will not trigger coverage for the entire building, but it will for the unit that the elevator is present in. If there is no elevator in the building, and again, this law does not require that you put in an elevator. So if there is not an elevator, we need to determine where the ground floor units are located in this building. They may not be at grade. This law requires that if you have a covered multifamily dwelling, you must provide an accessible entrance on an accessible route, unless it's impractical to do it by the site, not design choices, such as having perhaps commercial or retail at grade, or a garage space at grade. The first level containing a dwelling unit is considered the ground floor under this law. So in a mixed use building, we could have our dwelling units starting at what we might call level 2. That's the ground floor for purposes of the Fair Housing Act. And that level must be located on an accessible route. Maybe it's an elevator this time. And all of those dwelling units would be required to comply. You could have a unit that is at grade, and that would establish the ground floor for the building, and you would not be required to provide vertical access to the rest of the floors. This is a long list of HUD-approved guidelines and standards that can be used to comply with the requirements once you've determined you're looking at a covered multifamily dwelling with dwelling units that are required to comply. The Fair Housing Act, as written in statute, is different than what we're familiar with, maybe under Section 504 or the Americans with Disabilities Act, in that neither the statute or the regulations governed by HUD dictate what accessibility standard you must use to comply. It has been said that the goal was to give the design industry more flexibility than one single prescribed standard, and that HUD had the intention really of updating their own regulations on a more regular basis, similar to code cycle. And it's become evident over the years that that cycle to amend, approve, and adopt regulations just can't follow the same timing as building code revisions. And so what they've ended up doing over the years, for better or worse, is to adopt a list of what they call safe harbors that you can choose from to comply with the design requirements of this act. They've not sunsetted any of their historical safe harbors, but they've added on to the list, we'll say, over the years since '91. The first safe harbor is their very own HUD's Fair Housing Accessibility Guidelines and a supplement that they added to it in '94. And the next one of HUD's I'll bring in is their own 1998 Fair Housing Act Design Manual. Those two HUD publications reference the ANSI 1986 standard. That combination is the basis of how this presentation has been put together in using HUD's own approved and published safe harbors. There are differences in those safe harbors and its references to the 86 ANSI as what you would find in the Michigan Building Code currently, and its reference to the more recent ANSI 2009 standard. I have tried to put a few of those differences into this presentation. Again, we're packing a lot into an hour, but recently, excuse me, at the beginning of this year, HUD pulled in the more recent ANSI standard 2009 as an approved safe harbor when it's used with the Fair Housing Act, HUD's regulations, and the guidelines, because you need those for scoping, when to determine you have a building that needs to comply. and then you use the ANSI standard for the technical criteria. They're also now referencing all of the recent IBCs. So this is so helpful for all of the states that have already adopted a version of the International Building Code with an ANSI reference, and it can help to streamline the state building code with these requirements. What these requirements are listed here. There are 7 design and construction requirements under the Federal Fair Housing Act. These requirements are listed in the statute as fairly broad, without prescription, or that is criteria on how to comply. So we arrive at the site, we need an accessible building entrance on an accessible route. We're going to typically encounter public and common use areas first. Those are required to be accessible. Once we get to the dwelling unit, we'll be looking at the door into the unit and other accessible doors and accessible spaces. And once we're through that door, we need an accessible route into and through the dwelling unit that is subject to these requirements. Now we get a good understanding that these requirements will not give you the same level of access as those units that are being made accessible due to maybe some HUD funding or being part of a public entity, housing authority, for instance. The requirements under the Fair Housing Act result in what we call a usable or adaptable dwelling unit. And so the light switches, electrical outlets, thermostats, and environmental controls need to be in an accessible location. There needs to be reinforcing in the bathroom walls for later grab bars, and usable kitchens and bathrooms, not necessarily accessible. What the statute is doing here is building a framework for a unit that hopefully could be modified rather easily and at a reasonable expense for someone who may need to heighten their features. Requirement 1, an accessible building entrance on an accessible route. As I mentioned earlier, when you've determined you have a covered multifamily dwelling, that is a building after March 13th of 1991 with 4 or more units, then the law requires that we provide an accessible route to an accessible entrance. This building presumably has dwelling units only. It is interconnected throughout this ground floor. There's no elevator. So all of these units on the ground floor are required to comply. This law requires that you provide at least one accessible entrance to all of these units. Not every entrance may be required to be accessible, but there may be more than one entrance that has been planned by design that would therefore have to be made accessible. But the law requires that you absolutely must provide at least one accessible building entrance on an accessible route. And this gives you a visual of where an accessible route needs to start and connect to throughout the site. This requires an accessible pedestrian route that is intended for use by pedestrians and that is safe for people with and without disabilities from all site arrival points to public and common use spaces and dwelling units that are subject to these requirements. So one site arrival point could be a bus stop near the property line. The public sidewalk is going to meet up somewhere with the property line, even the public street. These are site arrival points, and we need our accessible pedestrian route to start there. And then it needs to connect to these, maybe this is the leasing office or clubhouse. Here's our apartment building. Here's another common building or apartment building. Our route needs to get to all of these spaces. An accessible route is required to public and common use spaces, but you can use a vehicular route if the site is impractical to, install an accessible pedestrian route. There are certain conditions that must be met, and they are laid out very well in the Fair Housing Act Design Manual. Basically, it's where our finished grade is going to exceed the maximum slope of a ramp, 8.33%, and that these conditions are beyond the control of an owner to provide an accessible pedestrian route. You are allowed to use a vehicular route if you provide accessible parking at the dwelling units and you provide accessible parking at the amenity that is otherwise unreachable by an accessible pedestrian route. I will take this moment to say that HUD is expecting accessible pedestrian routes, routes intended for pedestrians, not vehicular routes only. So what are the general requirements for an accessible route? I think I need to pick up my speed. I'm looking at the time, so I will talk fast. We need a 36-inch wide route. We need a sidewalk slope. This is just going to be a walking path, a running slope between 0% and 5%. That's this route here. The cross slope of these routes, or that is the angle at which we are fighting against to travel along this route, the maximum cross slope is 2%. And then if we are above 5%, we're on a ramp. We cannot go any higher than 8.3% or it's not considered accessible. So any path that is in this range of 5 to 8.3% is going to be considered a ramp. That's the maximum slope. And this is what we're looking at as criteria for ramps. There's a landing at the bottom. There's a landing at the top. If our ramp run is over 30 feet, we need intermediate landings. We need handrails on both sides. And we need edge protection to keep perhaps the wheel of a walker or the front wheel of a chair from coming through the bottom rail and extending over the edge. We encounter curb ramps everywhere that we come from accessible parking or where we are crossing an intersection. So where our accessible route encounters a curb, there must be a compliant curb ramp. ANSI, the ANSI standard goes over 3 primary curb ramps designs: flared, built up, and returned. They all have a maximum running slope on the ramp portion of 1 and 12. The flares have a maximum slope of 1 and 10. Probably one of the most successful ramp designs, though, that we see is the inline or parallel ramp, because a person can travel along maybe the access aisle of parking, or they've come through a well-marked crosswalk, and they have a level landing here by which they can turn left or right, and then they're dealing with this running slope here. Other ramps that have flares, especially the flared one here, not the built up, that we see more often in alterations, because we don't want the curb ramp running into the access aisle or the intersection. But on this flared ramp, it takes up a lot of space. We need at least 36 inches here at the top of the ramp. And if someone is traveling perpendicular, they might be fighting this flare to come down here rather than following the ramp slope to a level landing, making it much easier to make a turn. And here's just another illustration of curb ramps. This is the problem here that we often see. This may not have been designed to be wide enough. And so we might end up having this portion, which is required to be compliant, actually existing along this portion, and the flares will make the slopes non-compliant. Wheel stops, or a well designed route with an additional width to allow for vehicle overhang is also important to maintain the minimum width of our accessible route as we're passing along parking. The accessible route has limitations in level changes. We've just discussed how we could get over those, but if we're not going to, then we need to be able to maintain this throughout the lifetime of the project. A vertical change can only be a 1/4 inch. If it's over a 1/4 inch, then we're really looking at a 1/2 inch maximum where we can bevel at 1 and 2. Once the level change is over a 1/2 inch, then we need to look at ramping slopes. So property maintenance is critical on these projects, especially over time where there can be settling or tree rooting. And this is our accessible route that is now highly deficient in these vertical level change restrictions. And so here's a list of common violations that we will see under requirement 1 or for our accessible route. Slopes and cross slopes exceeding the maximums, vehicle overhang reducing our width, changes in level that exceed a 1/4 inch, ramp slopes that exceed 8.3%. This actually is a little hard to see in the photo now, but this is pretty steep. You could get maybe it'd be fun in the winter. And curb ramps. Curb ramps are often a problem. Site impracticality is allowed for under requirement 1, an accessible building entrance on an accessible route, because Congress understood when they wrote this law that there would be areas in our nation where it would be considered impractical to make these buildings accessible, but that we would still be building. And so HUD's Fair Housing Act Design Manual, there's a link here, and I have another slide at the end of the presentation, really does give the most detailed information on how these tests are supposed to be laid out, conducted, and kept on record, because they will determine a permitted reduction in the number of compliant units. And it could lead to a building that is entirely exempt based on this impracticality. We don't have time to get into those details today. One thing that is very important to note, though, is that if the building has an elevator or is planned to in new construction, site impracticality cannot be claimed. The work that's done that would allow for an elevator to be in a building, has been stated that that should be enough to be able to grade for accessible routes. So buildings with elevators are not permitted to claim site impracticality. Requirement 2, accessible and usable public and common use areas. As I mentioned earlier, HUD's regulations reference the ANSI 86 standard, and they still do allow use of that standard. I don't know of any states, maybe there are 1 or 2, that still look to the 86 because of its reference in the guidelines. But HUD does also recognize and approve current ANSI standards. So we could be looking at the 2009 now, and would be for Michigan projects. So the public and common use areas have to be accessible, and that is done by meeting the ANSI standard in these spaces. The Americans with Disabilities Act was actually passed just after the Fair Housing Act was amended to include people with disabilities as a protected class and these design requirements. So the Fair Housing Act as a law doesn't require an overlap of compliance with the ADA. It didn't exist yet. But I'm taking this time to note that public spaces, places of public accommodation on these sites, typically we'd be talking a sales or leasing office, and its parking and its restrooms are also subject to the ADA standards. Spaces that are not typically intended for the general public, this might be our game room, our fitness center. Those, if they are intended only for use by guests and residents, they're not places of public accommodation. They would not be subject to the ADA standards in a private project, but they would be subject to being accessible still under the ANSI standard. I just checked the Q&A really quick. Sorry for the silence there. Washing
Oh,
machines and
Amber,
dryers.
Amber,
Yeah, you
we
want-
we can cut in with some questions or we can do it at the end, but we're making note of the questions, so.
Okay, then we will pick those up at the end, hopefully. One major thing that comes under common use amenities is mailboxes. And this is because the scoping documents and even the standard don't cover HUD's current position, which is that all mailboxes that serve covered dwelling units must be within an accessible reach range. Now in Michigan, we're looking at 15 to 48 inches because we reference ANSI 2009 within our building code for accessibility requirements. HUD still recognizes the 86 standard, so there could be some projects looking even up to 54. But for Michigan projects, we're really looking at this 48 max top range in a high-rise elevator building. This is all of the mailboxes in the building. It can be a huge design challenge. Oops, click, there we go. And another thing that's important in public and common use areas, not only at accessible routes, but also our general circulation routes are reduced vertical clearance, or that's headroom under stairs. These are also considered protruding objects, essentially something that could be unsafe for people with visual impairments who might use a cane to guide themselves around obstacles. Something that's between 27 inches and 80 inches, they're not likely to pick up with the sweep of their cane and could walk into this and be injured. Recreational facilities are required to be located on an accessible route per HUD's guidelines. Now with newer IBCs and ANSI standards, we could be looking at, for state project requirements, a higher level of accessibility in these recreational facilities. So far, there's a similar exemption for what we call type B dwelling units in the ANSI standard. These are dwelling units intended to meet fair housing, where the swimming pool is required to be located on an accessible route, but a lift into the pool, so still is not required. That was something that came from HUD's guidelines and hasn't been picked up yet in private residential projects. We need an accessible route to at least one of each type of recreational facility. If we have 3 tennis courts, we need an accessible route to at least one of those tennis courts. Some common violations we see in public and common use spaces. We talked about the reduced clearance under stairs. We see a lot of violations in toilet rooms and bathing rooms, grab bar locations, toilet center lines. These are things you're probably very familiar with. Knee space under sinks in bathrooms. Compliant common use kitchen design is also something that we see issues with often. Moving on to requirement 3, usable doors. I like to make a distinction here. The doors leading to public and common use spaces are required to be accessible doors. They need to meet all of the requirements of the ANSI standard: clear width, maneuvering clearance on both sides, threshold restrictions, accessible hardware, opening force. These are all the provisions that would make a manual swinging door fully accessible to meet these standards. And so these are the doors leading into the building, public and common use amenity spaces, and the door to the dwelling units.
Amber,
again,
Amber,
yes.
kind of, you go back to the previous slide. It just fits this question so well. By Jennifer, does an accessible route include an automatic door opener?
A manual door can be considered an accessible door if all of these provisions are met. So I think I'll answer it this way first. A door does not have to be an automatic door to be considered an accessible door occurring along an accessible route. If an automatic or power operated door is planned for, then it also does have to meet certain requirements. Sara later will be talking about reasonable accommodations and modifications, and she might get into what sort of accommodations or modifications people may need to seek when they're dealing with opening force of a manual swinging door, which can be a problem at fire doors, and we know this. That would be an overarching life safety requirement, and the standards allow opening force to be set under that administrative authority rather than these accessibility requirements. So perhaps Sara will get into that later if that's where the question is coming from. In my experience, it often is.
Thank you.
You're welcome. So we're looking at accessible hardware, minimum clear width of the door, opening force. There is a door pressure gauge you can use to test the pressure. It's 5 pounds max on interior doors. Exterior doors this has moved out of the standard for exterior doors. There are too many variables. Wind resistance. I'm here in Michigan, I'm in Michigan too, by the way. You know, we can be looking at ice buildup, and then again, fire doors. We're looking at threshold limitations on accessible doors, maneuvering clearance on both sides. The ANSI standard will give you exactly what these sizes are for door maneuvering clearance, and depending on which way you approach the door. Within a dwelling unit, now we're through the door to the dwelling unit. That's an accessible door. Now I'm in this Fair Housing Act covered dwelling unit. It's adaptable or it's usable. And almost everything goes away about the door except the width. I'm no longer required to have accessible hardware, opening force, or maneuvering clearances. And my width has gone from a minimum 32 to a nominal 32. This is really to allow for a standard 34-inch residential door within these dwelling units. So a 34-inch door typically will yield a usable opening of a nominal 32. HUD's design manual calls it 31 5/8. The ANSI standard, the 2009, is 31 3/4. This is important for designers. When you're selecting your doors, you need to pay attention to the thickness, because that will reduce the opening width and can get you to less than 31 3/4. This applies to all doors intended for user passage within the unit. It could even be into a large walk-in closet. So some common violations we see under requirement 3 is that maneuvering clearance has not been provided at doors and gates. I think I see this far more at gates. Threshold height is often a problem, and the opening force and closing speed also are often a problem. Requirement 4, we have arrived at the site. We've successfully, on a pedestrian route, gotten into the building. We've successfully traversed to the door, and now we are in the unit. We need an accessible route into it and through it. So this is an illustration from HUD's Fair Housing Design Manual. We've entered through our accessible door here, and now this route is required throughout the unit to go through doors intended for user passage and to connect to the clear floor spaces that are required at fixtures and appliances. And then to connect to, though with some permitted conditions that I'll get to at a secondary exterior door that leads to a private patio, deck, or balcony. This is where our 36-inch wide route needs to get us to. Some unique design features are still permitted in these units. We used to see sunken features. They kind of went away and they seem to be coming back into design trend. So you can have a sunken feature like this living room that we see on the left, but it cannot interrupt the accessible route to other spaces required to be on an accessible route. It can't interrupt the route to the bathroom. It can't interrupt the route to the kitchen unless we provide access through it. You can have a loft space in these units. So a loft would be open to the surrounding space and no more than 33.33% of the space below. So what we cannot have located on this loft is any feature that's required to be on an accessible route within a single level unit. We can't put a bathroom up here. All of the bathrooms would be required to be on an accessible route. It would be unlikely that we'd put a kitchen up here, but we don't put the kitchen up here. It's required to be on an accessible route. So you can have a loft space, but it does have limitations. Flooring transitions and door thresholds, they occur along the accessible route, and so we are limiting abrupt level changes within the unit as well. We are looking at the primary entrance threshold here. So the interior finished floor, the top of the threshold, and the exterior surface are really what we're looking at. The top of the threshold can be under HUD's guidelines, no more than 3/4 inches from the finished floor to the top of the threshold. On the exterior side of the door, because of a combination of things, we're allowed 1¼ inches from the finished surface to the top of the threshold. At a secondary door leading to a private patio, deck, or balcony, the accessible route can be interrupted more than what we had just looked at for the primary door. This was a recognition primarily to our coastal regions and water and rain infiltration, excuse me. And so, for instance, in Florida. So at these secondary exterior doors, HUD's guidelines allow for not only this 3/4 inch threshold height from the inside of the finished floor to the top of the threshold, but they allow from the finished floor to the outside surface, if it's impervious, where water will settle and not drain through, up to a 4-inch completely vertical step down for a total of 4¾ inches from the, we'll say maybe it's a concrete patio surface to the top of the door threshold. Some common violations we see here will be no surprise. Entry door threshold problems, patio door threshold problems, and then at flooring transitions. So we really need to be careful where we're transitioning between maybe linoleum to carpet, tile to carpet, or any difference therein. If we can keep a level transition, that's best for everyone. But if we can't and we need a strip like this, then we have to follow the 1/4 inch vertical or 1/2 inch max with 1 and 2 bevel. 10 minutes, I'm gonna fly. Light switches, electrical outlets, thermostats, and other environmental controls need to be located at an accessible height within the dwelling unit. Light switches, outlets, thermostats, security devices. Think about things that are used by residents on a regular basis. Those controls that are not covered, controls on movable appliances like microwaves, If the control is on the hood over a range, it's not required to comply. If it's on a switch on the wall, that switch is required to comply. Special use wall outlets, we don't see telephone jacks much anymore. But circuit breaker panels, specifically in looking at HUD's 98 design manual, these would not be subject to reach range, but in looking at newer ANSIs, like the 2009, they are required to be within that ANSI reach range. So we need to, oops, I did this wrong. I'm sorry. I corrected this and I went the wrong way. So what we need to do is have the uppermost operable part no higher than 48 inches above the floor. If our outlet or switch is located over an obstruction like a kitchen counter, then it needs to come down to 46 inches because we can't reach as far over an obstruction. I should be putting this line at the wall outlet to the bottom receptacle. That's where I meant to put it. Every operable part in this receptacle, both of these, need to be within reach range. And unfortunately, I can't do anything with this line right now, but it needs to come down to the bottom outlet. Oftentimes, electricians will be measuring to the center of the box. And if we measure or design that at 15, then we put in our flooring. It isn't that both of the outlets will be within reach range anymore. So again, please ignore this going to the top outlet. It needs to go to the bottom one. And the common violations, it would be located over 48 inches, the outlet or switch, the reach depth may be more than what is permitted if it's located over an obstruction. Requirement 6 is reinforced walls for the later installation of grab bars. In these adaptable dwelling units, it's not required to have the grab bars installed, but it is required to have reinforcing that will allow for future grab bars. HUD's guidelines, I really don't know why. Truly,
Amber.
after all these years.
Amber, I got a question on the grab bars.
Yes.
Question is, does requirement to provide reinforcement in the walls of the bathroom for handrails include reinforcements that are lower and would allow for attaching a shower or bath seat?
That's a very good question. There is one condition for showers only where reinforcing for a shower seat would be required. That is if there is one shower, let me say this right. There's one bathing fixture in the unit. It is a shower and it measures 3 by 3. What we're looking at here is it's the only bathing fixture in the unit. So it has to be considered quote unquote usable. And if someone opts for the 3 by 3 size, we put the reinforcing in for a seat because we are building the framework for a transfer shower. Reinforcing for bathtub seats, not required under this law at all. Any other shower, or if there's more than a shower in the unit, then that seat reinforcement requirement goes away. So we're looking at surrounding toilets, the wall surround of bathtubs, and the wall surround of showers. If you're familiar with the ANSI standard and the minimum sizes of grab bars, you might notice that these minimum areas here and here, so at the side of the toilet and behind the toilet, are not the same length as an ANSI compliant grab bar. What has happened in the ANSI standard for type B dwelling units is that exceptions have been built in to match these guidelines of HUDs that will say if the wall area does not allow for a grab bar of that size, then you can come down to say this size, 24 inches behind the toilet. If a toilet is going to be positioned between two fixtures, very common, like a bathtub and a vanity, or maybe it isn't surrounded by walls at all, then we're still required to provide reinforcing for a sidebar. In this case, it would be enlarging or increasing the size of the reinforcing behind the toilet to allow for a fold down bar. Or, and I don't know that I ever see this actually planned for, we could use floor reinforcing for a floor mounted bar. Here we are at bathtubs. We have this area on the rear wall that would allow for two back wall bars. The ANSI standard now would also require a vertical bar at the control end of the bathtub. And so we would need reinforcing for a vertical bar here to comply with ANSI requirements. The common violations we see, I would say primarily, is that reinforcing hasn't been planned for all of the units that are covered, or maybe it hasn't been planned in every bathroom. So these reinforcement requirements do apply to every bathroom in the unit, even if that particular bathroom isn't considered a usable one, which is what we'll be getting into. Requirement 7, usable kitchens and bathrooms. There are some general requirements in the kitchen: clear floor space at appliances, a clearance in the kitchen between opposing elements, and then some additional clearance in U-shaped kitchens. Clear floor space at fixtures is required to be 30 by 48 inches. This is the basic footprint of a small manual wheelchair that we see throughout these standards. And so there must be a 30 by 48 inch clear floor space at the sink, at the range, oven, cooktop, at the refrigerator, at the dishwasher. Typically oriented in a parallel orientation, unless we are in a public and common use space, and then we might see a requirement for forward orientation at the sink or a cooktop, but not in the usable dwelling units. Centered on the range, centered on the refrigerator. In the ANSI standard, or I'm sorry, on the sink, I said refrigerator. Centered on the range, centered on the sink. In the ANSI standard, because the style of refrigerators varies so greatly, they have now worked in language for this clear floor space, not to be directly centered on this appliance that has a door that you need to open, but to be offset from the center. The minimum clearance in these kitchens is 40 inches within the kitchen. At least 40 inches is required between opposing elements: countertops, walls, and appliances. This excludes door handles and pulls or the hardware on the appliance. You can see the dimension line here is going to the face of the refrigerator, and it's excluding the refrigerator handles. I like to show you here in plan. This 40 inches is measured at the narrowest point. Refrigerators these days are monsters. Ovens are getting big again too, or here's the oven. And so we need to be watchful of how deep our appliances are. If we're only measuring between the countertops, but some of our appliances protrude more, we may not have 40 inches in the kitchen. HUD's Fair Housing Design Manual has a unique requirement for U-shaped kitchens, and it is conditioned on whether there's a sink, cooktop, or range at the base of the U shape. Because a parallel clear floor space is required for that particular fixture, sink, cooktop, or range, HUD requires a 60-inch circle at the base of the U, so a person using a chair can maneuver to parallel at that appliance. The ANSI standard now requires a minimum clearance like this between everything in the entire U-shaped kitchen, not only a circle at the U. HUD's manual in a U-shaped kitchen allows you to reduce that 60 inches if you've provided knee space under the sink or cooktop. You cannot do that under the ANSI standard now. That would not be considered compliant in one of these units. If we're looking to say ANSI 2009, it's still a U-shaped kitchen. It doesn't matter what is at the base of the U, and you need the 60 inches. Some common violations that we see here: the clear floor space is not centered where it's supposed to be. The minimum clearance between opposing elements has not been provided for. often because of the appliance projection into the kitchen. Removable cabinets for sinks, and designing to minimums and maximums. These ranges are built in. Your tolerance is there if you give yourself room within the range. If you design to the minimum or maximum in the field, there are going to be issues. All right, usable bathrooms. I know I'm going over time, but I think I can get through this. Usable bathrooms. Again, these are not accessible. These are considered usable so that they can be modified later. In the usable bathroom, there are some general requirements. You need a clear floor space beyond the swing of the door so you can get in and shut the door behind you. And you need clear floor space at certain bathroom fixtures. So here's our clear floor space beyond the swing of the door. We can get in, close the door behind us. We may not be able to turn around. There are two different bathroom design options for these usable dwelling units, A bathroom and B bathroom. HUD's design manual calls them specification A and specification B. The ANSI standard calls them option A and option B. You can choose A or B. It is designer's choice. If there's only one bathroom in the unit, you can choose A or B. If there's more than one bathroom in the unit and you decide to choose the A option, those options must be complied with in all of the bathrooms in the unit. If you choose the B option, you can apply that to only one bathroom in the unit, and it's the bathroom of your choice. Common requirements in the A and B bathrooms. They both require a clear floor space at the vanity that is centered on the sink for a parallel approach. You can provide a forward approach, but you have to provide knee space, and you can use removable base cabinets. This is to show you two things. If I'm doing a parallel approach at the sink and I have to center my clear floor space on the sink, I need at least 24 inches off the wall. If I want a smaller vanity than 48 inches, I can do that, but I need to offset the sink so I can get it centered at the clear floor space. There's also the same clearances required around the location of the toilet. These are different from the design manual now to particularly the ANSI 2009 standard. The size of clearance, this 48 by 66 that you see here, or the 48 by 56, those have not changed. They're dependent on the direction of approach to the toilet. That's the first requirement, the clearance around the toilet. Where you put the toilet in the clearance has changed a little. HUD's design manual requires 18 inches absolute from the side wall, and then 15 inches at least to any other overlap into this clearance. That other overlap can only project 24 inches into the toilet clearance. If we're not next to a sidewall, maybe it's a bathtub, we have an 18-inch minimum requirement. But if we're looking at the ANSI standard, and that's what we'll be looking at in Michigan, especially for new construction. Now this is the 16 to 18 range for a remaining clearance of 33 inches behind the toilet if we've put in this overlap for 24 inches max. So the primary difference here is we're no longer looking at a very problematic absolute dimension in the field of 88 inches, but to a more workable range of 16 to 18 for the toilet location. Clearance at the bathtub shower combo, not shower stalls, but a standard bathtub shower combo unit. It's a large clearance, but in the A bathroom, the toilet can overlap it. And of course, the lavatory can overlap the toilet clearance. What we're really left with is a 30 by 48 inch wheelchair clear floor space that's perpendicular to the bathtub. There's no requirement for the location of the controls in the A bathroom. In the B bathroom, it is a 30 by 60 clear floor space, no overlap allowed. And the toes of the clear floor space need to align with the control wall of the bathtub. Common violations here, clear floor spaces aren't centered on the lavatory. A huge one I see is that we don't have 30 by 48 inches beyond the door swing. I see that a lot, especially in compartmentalized bathrooms, where we may have, let's say we have a Jack and Jill double vanity. As soon as we go into the bathroom, and then we have a privacy water closet compartment with a door. We have to have 30 by 48 inches beyond the swing of both doors for each compartment. Water closet location has been a problem. I think that this will help with the 16 to 18 range that's now approved. Again, designing to minimums and maximums instead of working within the middle of the ranges. This one that says both lavatories not designed to be compliant in A bathrooms, that has actually gone away in the ANSI standard. If you choose option A, only one lavatory has to comply. And that wraps up 7 design and construction requirements under the Fair Housing Act with their common violations. Steve mentioned, and I share this with you, that HUD does have a program called Fair Housing Accessibility First. I'm no longer on that program, but the website is there. I don't know how much activity is on it right now, and you can try the information line. If you would like to contact me, there's my contact information as well. You can email me or give me a call. And I'm going to turn it.
Well, I have a couple questions. This
Yes, I was going to
rapid
say
fire.
back over to Steve to get to the questions.
Here we go.
Okay.
Should washing machines and dryers be accessible?
In public and common use spaces, at least one of each type of laundry equipment is required to comply fully with the ANSI standards requirements for laundry equipment. In the dwelling units, the short answer is no. And a little bit more detail is that now in the ANSI standard, in these dwelling units, you do need a clear floor space in front of the equipment, but there isn't a requirement that, say, the door opening or the operable parts be in reach range.
Okay, another question. For recreational purposes, if a complex has a pool and the complex accepts Section 8 vouchers, but not necessarily direct funding from HUD, are they required for the pool area to have a lift and accessible showering change areas?
So Sara might get into this a little bit later. Vouchers, I think I'll start with this. Vouchers that a person can use at different properties, that's a tenant-based assistance. And in that case, the law reads that the tenant is the one that's, so to speak, federally funded. So that would not be a design trigger under Section 504, and that housing provider also would not have to pay for that modification. At a Section 8 project-based property, where the project is the direct recipient of the funding, then they would be expected to pay for modifications. I don't know the details of how that works with the level of their funding and what they have to show that is available, undue burden, et cetera.
Okay, and then
Yep, go ahead, Steve. I was just going to say in design and construction, under the Federal Fair Housing Act, so far we're looking at access into the water is not required. But if we have a rinsing shower, then there are some requirements that we would apply to that rinsing shower.
And are there any changes to these requirements depending on the number of bedrooms? Meaning, would there be some, say someone needs someone else to occupy a unit to assist a person with a disability?
That would probably be dealt with under a reasonable accommodation request to be able to transfer units. And now I think we might be getting into Section 8 assistance and number of bedrooms and what we might need for other things, caregiver or medical equipment, which is just not a part of these design requirements. But Sara might get into that as she comes in.
Yeah, this is maybe a little one that looks like from the enforcement side. Does anyone have an inconspicuous way to measure slope during a test?
An inconspicuous way. And I'm sorry, guys, I'm trying to put my face back up, but I haven't figured out how to do it.
I think you're up. I think your face
Oh, I
is
am.
up.
Oh, I just
Yeah.
can't see myself. That's okay. An inconspicuous way. That's a good question. Boy, a baby stroller. We can't really pull shopping carts out. Not so much. I mean, really, we need a level to find out what the slope is, or the cross slope. An inconspicuous way, this is a guess of mine in my own experience, is to have something on wheels and see how much drag you get, how much pull there is. Maybe you have a friend who uses a chair.
Yeah. Okay, is a wheelchair ramp a common use area?
Mostly, yes, because a ramp is going to be required wherever our accessible route is encountering level changes. And so those requirements are going to apply in any space that is considered public and or common use, but not within the dwelling unit. So my general answer is most likely if we're not within the dwelling unit and we're at a ramp at a property constructed after 91 that was subject to these requirements, that ramp has to comply.
Okay, thank you so much. Appreciate it.
Sure.
Let me see if I can take over the screen. Thank you. I really appreciate you coming.
You're welcome. I'll stop my share. That should help you.
Yeah, I think everybody can see it now. But miraculously, the break time changed. So we're going from 10:10, we're about 10:14 Michigan time. There's people joining from other parts of the country, so 10 after the hour. But we're going to pick up at 20 after 10:20 for the Eastern time zone where we're at. But kind of short a little bit, but I don't want to lose any time for Sara. Amber, I thought it was a terrific. I thought it was very, very informative and clear. And again, I don't think we're looking to make all of us design and construction requirement experts, but just to kind of alert us to what some of those requirements are. And if we encounter a situation, people with disabilities encounter a situation, to know to dig a little bit further and get the specific answers that are needed. And Amber, again, this triggers any new construction built after 1991, correct?
That's right. If there are 4 units in the building and HUD considers a building to be anything attached to something else. So what the building code considers a building may not be the same as what the law considers a building. So this is my way of saying, if we're looking at anything with 4 or more units somehow attached to each other, and it was designed for construction after March 13th of 1991, and that is so many properties now, then we need to be looking at these fair housing design requirements. And I'll say in Michigan, there aren't too many places where it's going to be considered impractical. You probably have to be up in the UP.
Okay. Thank you so much. Appreciate you
And
taking
to
time
everyone
to
who
join us.
has said thank you in the chat, you're welcome. It's been a pleasure to be here. I hope that I've been able to teach you more today.
All right, we're going to pick up at 20 after the hour. Thank you, everybody. Welcome, Sarah.
Hey there, welcome back. I saw the end of the presentation, it was good.
Yeah, we should go into the afternoon and put you guys in a panel and have more discussion.
Yeah, that would have been okay. He seems to know pretty well this stuff. A couple
Yeah.
of things that she said that I thought were interesting. We've used as LCM as experts in a number of cases, and they've been so busy, they haven't always been available to us.
You're sharing your slide with your notes, so you want to switch it to you, so it just does your PowerPoint.
Oh, yeah. Okay, yeah, I do. Let's see how to do that. No, that's
Oh.
not it.
Switch your share. Nope. Yeah, I guess maybe that might work
Let's see.
from beginning.
Yeah.
Yeah, just click from beginning. Yeah, right there.
Yeah. That do it?
No, I think you may need to hit the share button
Okay. Yeah, I'm sharing.
at the bottom. So at the bottom under, it's a Zoom control. You'll be sharing a different part of your screen.
Okay. Well, you've got a lot of people. So I see the share.
There it is. Perfect. You got it.
Okay, but can you see the second one now?
No, you have to click on the main display and then that did it.
This isn't, no, this isn't right.
There you
There?
go. Yep.
Okay, great.
All right, so welcome, Sarah. Visiting with us all the way from Washington, D.C., is that correct?
No, actually, if we want to be completely accurate, I'm coming to you all the way from Bethany Beach, Delaware today.
Of course. Okay. Well, welcome.
Thanks.
That's certain advantages to doing things online and remote like this. But I could spend 20 minutes, 30 minutes on your background, but many people already know. You're now working as counsel at Relman Colfax, Washington, D.C. law firm. Congrats to the new judge from your office.
Right, my colleague Gia Cobb, partner in the firm, was just confirmed yesterday as a federal district court judge in Washington, D.C. We're so excited for her. It's a great selection. We're very pleased.
Yeah, we had the pleasure of working with her on a case, and truly outstanding to work with. She's going to be a wonderful contribution to the federal bench in DC. But anyway, Sarah, you've done a number of significant settlement and cases involving accessibility, and it's still ongoing. And you were involved in the drafting of the regulations. You've issued numerous policy statements, the elements of proof memo, though the current version doesn't have your name on it, the one a couple years earlier clearly does. And I really haven't seen much of a change between the two. But I appreciate all that you've done. Amber has high words for you as well. You were involved in getting the Accessibility First program up and running. And certainly years of dedication to fair housing. I refer your understanding as encyclopedic and a walking Fair Housing Act. And, I don't want to put pressure on you. So anyways, enough said. Okay. Really looking forward to your presentation. And again, we can do questions midpoint or keep them at the end, whatever you prefer. It's totally up to you.
Okay. So thanks, Steve, for that nice introduction. You know, there's a real advantage to being old because you've done a million things because you're an old person. I've had plenty of opportunities to work in fair housing. For those of you who know me, it's been 44 years that I've been working in fair housing, starting when I was 6. And I think this work is important. All power to you guys who are working in you know, on the front lines, trying to figure out how to handle situations, how to address them, how to fix things that might have gone awry. All credit to you. Today, I'm going to talk about a broader-based disability discrimination. Amber, I caught the end of your presentation on accessibility, great answers. And I did have done a lot of accessibility work in my time, but today's presentation that I'm going to do has to do with issues about accessibility, about other kinds of discrimination based on disability covered by the Fair Housing Act. So we're going to talk about the broader issues of how you frame up these issues, what the regs say. I'm going to try not to be too boring about that. We're going to talk a little bit about what is a disability under the law, how you talk to a person who has a disability. And I would just notice, put a pin in the framing that I used. A person with a disability is people first conversation. You don't talk about a handicapped person or something like that. You put the person first, so you say you're talking to a person, and a person who has a disability or even somebody who uses a wheelchair, as opposed to describing, putting the adjective first. We're going to talk about how an accommodation might be requested, what a good response is, what an interactive process might be in terms of actually real world life. And we're going to spend some time on assistive animals case because I cannot give a presentation on reasonable accommodations without getting 18 questions about assistive animals. So I'm going to move right into that in this presentation and hopefully answer most of your questions so I don't have to answer 15 of them at the end. And I'm going to talk about some reasonable accommodation issues in action today. Somewhere in there, I'm also going to talk about reasonable modifications and the distinction. Amber hit some high points on that in her presentation. I'm going to circle back to a little bit more detail about it by the end of the day. So I'm going to be talking till, I'm going to try to stop about 11:50 and engage with any questions. But if you put something in the chat, I may see it and be able to respond to it as we go along. So people with disabilities come in all shapes, colors, sizes, and presentations. And there are a lot of people who are seniors who are disabled by nature of age and general decrepitude. I can say that since I'm an older person myself. But there are lots of younger people with disabilities as well. And if I have one thing to say to you at the very beginning to frame up our discussion, it is that you don't engage in stereotypical thinking about somebody with a disability. And if you've ever watched wheelchair athletes on TV, you know that that's one frame, but don't assume that everybody who has a disability that uses a wheelchair is that person, because they're not, for sure. I've seen lines of thinking like this in all kinds of cases. Once when I was at HUD, someone from another program office came over and showed me a letter. And the letter said, please don't make me rent to anybody who is a paranoid schizophrenic again. We had one and it didn't work out. So, you know, stereotypical thinking, making assumptions about a whole group of people based on an experience with one person is also a sure and certain way to get yourself into trouble. So it is an individualized approach, and we're going to be talking about that throughout. But as I hope I will show you, it is not as complicated as some people make you want to think it is. Okay. So first and foremost, when we're talking and framing up what the law is around this stuff, you know, everybody wants to come in and tell me, oh gosh, Sarah, you know, we have somebody working with us and they know all about the ADA. And so I don't know how much we're going to need your help, or we don't know what we have to talk to you a lot about these things. And I have to say, the first thing I say to those folks is, well, I'm glad. That's good. They have some basic conceptual ideas that may also apply to fair housing. and we do look to the ADA, especially in court cases, for reliance on how to interpret the Fair Housing Act. But in fact, the real law that applies to housing is the Fair Housing Act. ADA has only some peripheral application to housing, usually in the parts of the housing that serves the public, like the rental office or the sales office if you're selling condos. Maybe have a separate sales office in a trailer or in a model home. ADA applies to those, and they also apply to any part of the housing that is open to the public generally, not just to the residents and the residents' guests, but to the public. And so we see that occasionally in situations where someone rents out a clubhouse and they make it available to people in the community for weddings and baby showers and various carryings on that make it more available. Sometimes we see a pool that's available publicly, and the ADA might apply to that pool, even though it's not just for the members and the guests, it's for neighborhoods to come in and pay for a membership. But in almost every case, it's the Fair Housing Act that you start with on this, because I'm going to tell you the truth, the ADA also has some limitations that we'll discuss specifically about assistive animals in a few minutes that do not exist in the Fair Housing Act. So an expert who wants to talk to you about the ADA in a housing context does not necessarily have full information. They have to also understand and be deeply involved with the Fair Housing Act, or be assisted by you or others to understand what the law is. I will also say that funding does make a difference if you're dealing, and Amber talked about this, if you've got federal funding in the property, not a voucher assigned to a tenant, but federal funding in the property, and not just from HUD, but from USDA or HHS, any federal funding, even the Department of Justice sometimes, imposes additional constraints and requirements on landlords and others. And I'll hit a few of those as we go along. But basically, if you have federal funding, you work for a public housing agency or a PBRA assisted housing with Section 8, go into the project, or 811, 202, home, any of the various HUD programs or the similar USDA rural housing or HHS McKinney-Vento or other funding for shelters, you're likely to be covered not only by the Fair Housing Act, but by Section 504, and in some cases, the ADA Title II as well. So there's more obligations. This presentation focuses on the Fair Housing Act, but we may get into a few more of the broader pictures, broader picture issues as we go along. Okay, so we have different kinds of discrimination in the Fair Housing Act. I think a lot of people think, well, it's just being mean to somebody because who has a disability, but that's actually an incorrect framing based on the way the law is written and based on who is protected. So the law applies to what we would call direct discrimination. And direct discrimination can sometimes be based on stereotypes, assumptions, and misunderstanding. For example, if someone says, oh, and it could be well-intended, but it can still be discrimination. It doesn't have to be mean at all. But for example, a case where a person who is blind lives in a second floor apartment and has lived there for several years, and the landlord comes and says, oh, so-and-so, we're going to ask you to move to the ground floor because we're afraid you're going to fall and hurt yourself because you're blind. Stereotype, misinformation, assumption. Somebody who is blind or vision impaired may be perfectly comfortable in a second floor unit, know their way all the way around it, in fact, may have their life significantly disrupted by an unexpected move to another unit. But that's direct, targeted discrimination. It might be well-intended, designed to protect either the tenant or possibly the landlord, but it's based on misinformation and it amounts to unlawful discrimination. A similar case I've seen in my lifetime, not that long ago, was a woman who had cancer and was dying. She lived in an apartment. She was dying. She had home health aides coming in. Family was involved and so forth. And the landlord tried to, wait for it, evict her because they said that she was too ill to stay in her own apartment. direct discrimination and stereotypes and assumptions, and as well might be well intended, but also would have been hugely disruptive to this woman who wanted to die in her own bed. So that's still common, and you see it everywhere from zoning codes, where a zoning code may have some provisions in it for group homes for the disabled, or similar language, and carve out special exceptions and requirements. That is a robust area of litigation for our firm. We just successfully went to trial on one against a city in Connecticut last week, successfully meaning that the group home that had been refused zoning approvals, and essentially people were trying to run them out of town, we sued the elected and appointed officials, both individually and in their official capacities, and we got a judgment for compensatory damages for the group home and $5 million in punitive damages because the city was told that what they were doing was discriminatory, and they proceeded anyway. So big area of work still in terms of sorting out some of the unfortunate zoning decision-making and ordinances that have direct discrimination included in them. We have the concept of unequal treatment. People with disabilities sometimes just flat out get treated differently. People look at them, they don't look them in the eye. I was a long time ago the wife of the man who used a wheelchair, and we would go someplace and people would look at me and talk to me and would pretend, as far as I could tell, that he wasn't even there. That's an easy example of unequal treatment, but in housing we see unequal treatment in terms of what's available, in terms of rent prices, in terms of access to opportunities, and so forth, both for people with physical and mental disabilities. We also have an idea where we look at rules and policies and practices and say, oh, well, this seems to be neutral, but look, when it's applied, it's going to hit people with disabilities harder. And in certain contexts, that might be as simple as a landlord who refuses to accept a Section 8 voucher, but Section 8 voucher holders in that community have a high percentage of people with disabilities. And so the policy could discriminate against voucher holders. Today, I'm going to focus on the next two kinds of discrimination. One is the idea of reasonable accommodation. That is, you've got a rule, you've got a policy, you've got a practice. Maybe it inadvertently or unexpectedly puts a particular heavy burden or a problem, presents a problem to a person with a disability. And an accommodation is a change in that rule or policy or practice, or in the way services are provided to make an accommodation to the particular disability-related needs of the individual. And that is, anything from having to pay an extra fee to live on the first floor when a person with a disability needs a first floor unit, allowing a transfer from a second floor to a ground floor when requested by the residents because they're increasingly physically disabled and can't handle the steps anymore, or waiving a no pet policy. These are examples. We're going to talk about them more in a few minutes. I'm going to talk a little bit about reasonable modifications under the Fair Housing Act, because these are the individual structural changes that might be made in a market rate apartment to make a person with a disability be able to use their property more easily. And when I was first married and we moved into our first market rate apartment that wasn't student housing, we found a place that looked good, but it was a little older, but it was affordable, so that was good. And we realized that there were a couple of changes that needed to be made to make it more usable by my husband, who used a wheelchair. So one of them was to add a little bit of a ramp at the front stoop to allow him to be able to come and go on his own from the apartment. And we asked for permission to put in a ramp there that we got permission to do. And then we also asked for permission to take off the bathroom door, because the bathroom door was one of those old narrow ones, and he couldn't get through the door in his wheelchair, but he could have if we took the door off the hinges. So we took the door off the hinges and he could get into the bathroom. These are modifications. They're structural changes made on behalf of a person with a disability, a physical disability normally, who need some adjustment in the physical environment to be able to let them use the place that they're living more successfully. And you've already heard Amber on the building housing to be more accessible. My presentation has some stuff about that at the end, but I'm not going to talk about it because Amber presented it so well. But it's just to let you know that these are categories of ways in which discrimination can occur under the Fair Housing Act. And so if you understand these, at least basically, they can help you make the correct decision when you're dealing with a person with a disability who has a specific concern or issue. So again, the Fair Housing Act covers these provisions. The reasonable accommodation provision includes discrimination against a buyer or a renter who has a disability. So that's Sarah coming to live in an apartment with her husband, and her husband has a disability. Both Sarah and I and my husband are covered because, first of all, he was going to be on the lease, but even if he weren't going to be on the lease because he was my kid using a wheelchair, that household would still be covered because they were living with the buyer or the renter, and that person who was living with us had a disability, like the child, or someone who's associated with a buyer or a renter who has a disability, like a visitor. So it's not really the person who's living in the apartment, but it is their visitor. Best friend uses a wheelchair. Best friend has a service animal. Best friend has a, you name it, some need for an accommodation. And I think in those last category of things, the question of what is reasonable in the circumstances does come into play occasionally, but I want you to know that they're covered and you have to consider it. And you can't just say, oh no, because you don't live there, you're not covered. I don't have to do anything to protect you. Okay. So here's the literal language from the regulations and from the statute. It's illegal to refuse to make a reasonable accommodation in rules, policies, practices, or services when such accommodations may be necessary to allow a person to equal access to their unit. And for modifications, it's a refusal to permit at the expense of the person with a disability structural modifications of the existing premises that are, again, necessary to allow the person full enjoyment of the premises. Notice that these are adjustments to allow equal opportunity, right? Because people with disabilities sometimes need that adjustment to be made for them to fully participate in their housing. That's the whole concept behind the changes, but in these provisions of the law. So a person with a disability, here's the definition. Oh my gosh. It's legal language, but I'm going to make you think about it anyway. So it's first somebody with a physical or mental impairment, and sometimes it's physical and mental. I've dealt with somebody with environmental chemical sensitivity, or who does have or other disabilities where the manifestation of their disability may be both physical and mental and emotional as well. And so knowing that you have that situation, you're thinking about changes and available and making accessible things, not just structurally and not just, for pets or something like that, but more like what is it that this individual needs to be able to have equal opportunity in housing. And that impairment has to substantially limit one or more of life's daily activities. I'm sure you've heard a million presentations on this. We're going to talk in a second about how you interview someone about this and how you figure that out. Because there are some people who claim they have a disability who don't have one within the meaning of the law. Just going to say. But on the other hand, your assumption about whether or not they have a disability is often maybe wrong. So how do you talk to someone about this to get them to tell you about it without asking inappropriate questions? We're going to talk about it. We also cover in this law people who are regarded as having a disability, but who do not in fact have a disability at the moment. That is to say that someone who is treated as having a disability, but in today's day-to-day life, their disability does not substantially affect one or more of life's daily activities. It could be as simple as someone who has bone cancer, and today they can do everything because they just got out of chemo and they're tired, but they can walk and talk and do everything they normally do, even work and, take a walk. But they still may be treated as having a disability. And then finally, we include in this law people who have a record of having a disability but are not disabled today. Someone who had cancer in the past but is still treated as being disabled by cancer, even though they are not typically impaired today, but they have that record. And so somebody who had seizures, for example, in the past, and it did impact their ability to do this, that, or the other, but today their disability is well controlled by medication. So, and so they don't have any substantial limitations on their life, but they can either be a person who's regarded as having an impairment or a person who has a record of such an impairment, or both. Okay, so here's what we're talking about. I will say, impairment means, limitations in performance, major life activities, walking, talking, seeing, breathing, shopping, taking a walk, all the things that we all do every day, COVID or no COVID, right? Are your major life activities. It includes both physical and mental impairments. I think the important thing I want to say about this is for the Fair Housing Act, temporary disabilities are not excluded. In some laws, they may be considered not to be included, but under the Fair Housing Act, there is no exclusion for temporary disabilities. And so if someone has an impairment that impacts their activities of daily living in a substantial way, and it's a physical or mental impairment, even if it is short term, they may be entitled to an accommodation. So if someone breaks their hip and needs assigned parking and a curb cut, it may be that you will get a request like that. And it may be that you have to fully consider making that accommodation, even though the disability is short term. The document at the bottom of the page is a valuable tool for anybody who works with these issues on a day-to-day basis. I don't want to tell you to read it. I don't want you to tell you to sleep with it under your pillow in the case that might invest you with some knowledge. But I will say, taking it out, making a copy, putting it in your desk, and when you get presented with a disability-related issue, pulling it out and taking a scan through the questions and answers. They put the questions in bold, so it makes it really easy. That's a good value and valuable thing for you to do. It's put out there for a reason. And honestly, the answers to many of your questions are actually in there if you would look at it, number one. And two, it's been out there forever. So it's since 2004. So, not knowing about it, if you're in the business of rental or selling properties, is kind of like a no-no, because it's like a tool of your actual work environment. So you should know about it and preferably have read it, at least look through it. Remember, I said the questions are in bold. You can do this. Okay, so here's the regarded as being impairment. It's all regulatory language. How boring. You can read about this later. You can look at the Fair Housing Act reasonable accommodation statement that I just mentioned to you. I do want to say there are some, the Fair Housing Act actually says there are a few cases where someone with a disability is not protected. And that's where the person with the disability, their conduct of that individual would present a direct threat to the health or safety of others. So if someone has a disability and last week they pulled a knife on someone in the property's elevator, that's someone whose tenancy would constitute a direct threat to the health and safety of other individuals. It also includes people whose conduct might result in substantial physical damage to the property of others or to the safety of others, unless the threat can be eliminated or reduced by reasonable accommodation. So here's the thing about that. Someone who punches holes in the walls for fun and has a history of that and could cause substantial physical damage to the property of others or to the safety of others. The question for you is, well, that's conduct that's bad and damaging and threatening. Is there any way we can accommodate this person? And you have to think about that before you take your adverse action. And maybe you need to have a discussion with them about it before you take your adverse action. And it might be as simple as offering them to consider a punching bag or one of those, things that kids, a bat and a ball, that people take out their frustrations on. But it might be that it might also include consultation with a care worker or other person who might be able to assist them in thinking about alternative ways to express their anger. Right? So the direct threat thing is not the end of the inquiry. Can that threat be remediated or reduced by some kind of reasonable accommodation? And I'll repeat again that having some idea, knowing about making assumptions or stereotypes or basing your decisions or your actions on your experience with someone with the same kind of disability or based on something you know from some friend of yours in school 15 years ago is not advisable. So you want to consider treating them objectively in every case. And as I suggested earlier, assuming that somebody is at risk and treating them differently because you think they might present a risk either to themselves. Notice the exclusion does not relate to a direct threat to the health or safety of that person. So you cannot take an action, mandate an action that is, even if somebody might be a direct threat to themselves. But treating them differently, either because they're a risk to themselves or because you think they might be a risk to someone else without strong evidence that they are at risk, can amount to illegal disability discrimination. And I'll tell you the absolute honest truth about this. One of my first clients when I first started out in the world was a guy named Alan who was a paranoid schizophrenic. And, he was annoying as hell. I'm going to tell you the truth. Okay, he would fill up my half an hour answering machine in my law office years ago with talking over the weekend. And I would come in on Monday morning and they were like, the recording was completely full because he had just called up and rambled on and on about some perceived slight or whatever. Nonetheless, annoying people can still be victimized by discrimination. And what happened with him, among other things, was that his current landlord treated him differently and tried to convince him to leave the property and move elsewhere in various discriminatory ways. He was annoying, I will give you that, but he was not a risk to anybody. And the fact that he talked to himself may have made people anxious around him, but he was not an actual risk. So keep that in mind when you think about these things. So when you're talking about somebody with a disability, there's some like immediate no-nos. Don't ask for a diagnosis. They don't say what's wrong with them, okay? Don't call them crazy. And this is controversial. I'm going to say it to you directly, however. Do not ask for a doctor's statement right out of your mouth. Why? Because that's going to get you in trouble. I'm going to tell you straight up, it's going to get you in trouble. If I had to say it even more clearly, if the person is obviously disabled, or if you have some reason to know that they're disabled, you may want to ask these questions, but you're in for a reasonable accommodation discussion. Because if the disability is obvious, HUD has said in writing multiple times and has dealt with this in multiple cases, you cannot ask for a doctor's statement if the disability is obvious. And you cannot ask for a special doctor's statement if the disability is known to you by some other reason. And I think the only exception to that comes at the end of the discussion when you're thinking about whether the particular accommodation is necessitated by this person's disability. Okay, you with me? Okay, so the first thing I want to advise on this is to treat people with disabilities as if they are, I don't know, other human beings. So when someone comes in and says that they're waiving a downloaded from the internet form saying they're entitled to a service animal or 3, and you're looking at them like, oh, there goes my morning. Well, smile. And look them in the eye and say, please come into my office and let's talk about this. Don't forget the smile. Okay, so here's some questions. Tell me about it. Tell me how your disability affects your life. If this is not a visible disability, you are very easily within your limits to ask about this. And even if the disability may be obvious and you're thinking, yeah, well, they use a chair, and so I know they're disabled, but that doesn't necessarily mean I understand why they need a service animal. So tell me about your disability. How does it affect what you do every day? Smile, nod, listen. Uh-huh. Uh-huh. Okay. You can ask questions like, does the effect on your daily life come and go, or is it sort of ongoing? How long has your disability affected you? How does your disability affect your ability to live in your apartment or do the things you need to do as a tenant? How's the connection here between what you're asking for and your disability? Do you consider yourself disabled today? If not, have you had times in the past you'll be disabled? How would you say people perceive you? Obviously, these last two bullets are trying to get as regarded as or having a record of. But these are just illustrative, right? It's more like a friendly conversation between people. You're not cross-examining them. You're not looking ugly at them. You're talking to them and you're inviting them to tell you. And I will say that you don't have to ask a lot of annoying questions, actually, because if you present yourself as being open to listening, you will hear what you need to hear in maybe a 10 or 15-minute conversation. Now, I know you're busy, but still. Here's your other clue. Listen to the answers. Ask follow-up questions. Nod, smile, listen. Okay. Can you explain to me why it is that you need the accommodation that you're asking for? I see that you use a wheelchair. What's your specific needs for the accommodation that you're talking about? And suddenly the person will be saying, I'm having depression. I'm having anxiety. My psychiatrist says I can't go, there's a reason why I can't go outside, and it's my depression and anxiety, but my psychiatrist said I needed, some kind of animal to sort of take me out of myself and get me out of my apartment. And I said, that's a great idea. Oh, you say, oh, it's starting to make sense to me now. Tell me some more. Now, how again is this, will an animal help you with your particular disability? Well, again, the doc says it'll help me get outside. It'll, draw my attention to someone else. I need someone to focus on. The dog will get me outside, and I will have to take the dog for walks, and that'll get me fresh air, and it'll be companionship, and I really need some company. It's been rough living by myself during COVID. And you're listening going, oh yeah, okay. Tell me how the accommodation will benefit you. Did you consider other accommodations? Now, I like this question. I don't think it's unfair to ask someone, did you consider other things? Like, could you go volunteer at the local shelter if you've got some big thing about pets? Or in other examples, are there other accommodations where someone has just gotten to some process where they've got it in their head, this is what they need? It's okay to ask whether they considered other accommodations. Okay, you can ask. But then you get a head start on an analysis that will help you think about whether this accommodation is something you can approve or not, or whether you have to go back and say, we can't do this, but we're going to think about doing this. Same thing with a structural modification. People come in and ask for, ramps and parking spaces and all of that. Accessible parking space is a reasonable accommodation because I said so, and it's been in the regulations since 1988. So if someone comes in and asks for an accessible parking place with a curb cut and a sign and a parking space, then and they want it reserved in their name, that is a reasonable accommodation. You cannot charge for it. It is not a structural modification. You have to do it, and preferably in the location that the individual requests or a similar location so that it addresses their disability-related needs. But there's lots of other modifications that people want to ask for. Can you tell me why you need the modification you've asked for? How will that help you live in the unit? What are your plans about implementing it? Do you have any idea about cost? There's some other questions you can ask. I'll get to those in a minute. So again, if the disability is obvious, you're generally expected to know that it's your tenant. So if they're walking with a cane, you're supposed to know that you got a tenant who walks with a cane. What about requesting supporting documentation? If the disability is obvious, you may not request supporting documentation. period, end of story, unless you've already gone through the, yes, I see that you walk with a cane. I see that you're asking for a service animal, but I don't understand the connection between what you're asking for and your disability. Please sit down, come into my office. Let's talk about this. Welcome, right? And let's talk about it. Documentation comes at the end, and only when, one, the disability is not obvious, or two, the need for this particular accommodation is not obvious. Okay, simple. 1, 2. Okay. If the disability is not obvious, though, you got to ask yourself, should I really know this person has a disability? Courts are going to say, and HUD's going to say, if you knew that this person was receiving SSDI income, which has disability in the name, that's a clue that you should have been paying attention that they have a disability. And that's true for mental disabilities. Do they have conduct manifestations that would allow a reasonable person to understand that they had a disability, right? They have Tourette syndrome, and it's obvious from the conversation. If they're like my former client, Alan, who talks to everybody and is obviously paranoid, you spend 5 minutes in the man's presence and you know he's seriously paranoid. It's obvious. However, landlords, I'm not knocking you. I'm just saying you got to be attentive here. If it is not obvious that someone has a disability, then you can ask for the documentation, but only at the end, not at the beginning. And you can have that coming from either backup confirmation or, actually have a conversation about it before you go further with the daggum form. If the housing provider doesn't know about the disability or genuinely doubts it, and I'm perfectly aware that sometimes there's real big reason to doubt that someone needs 3 Rottweilers as a reasonable accommodation. By the way, if you get a request for 3, whatever, Chihuahuas, parrots, llamas, whatever, right? You get to ask about the need for each one as a reasonable accommodation. So tell me the names of your animals. Oh, you've got 3 dogs. Well, wow. Tell me the name of the first one. That's Sparky. Okay. Well, tell me what Sparky provides for you in terms of assistance to you as a person with a disability. La, 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 la. You're listening. What about Marco? Well, Marco, blah, 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 blah. Well, what about Denise? Doggy Denise. Well, so she's in training. We do have a desire to growl sometimes when you hear about these conversations, but at least it is your right to understand that each separate animal or each separate accommodation is actually needed. And so if they've merged several requests into one, you can go through and ask about each one specifically. Pratt says that the documentation does not have to come from a doctor or be sworn to, either by you or by your doctor. HUD says that literally. And the link to the document where that is said is in the back of this training. So here's some other choices besides a doctor's statement: a disability determination from a federal, state, or local agency, SSDI income, folk rehab arrangements, a voucher that somebody gets only because they have a disability, like a NED voucher. You know what NED stands for? I think it's non-elderly disabled, like it's in the name. Information from a healthcare professional or counselor, not limited to a doctor, does not have to be from a doctor. The person's own statement that they are disabled can be accepted and not sworn to either. And the landlord must accept this type of information. I know this is controversial. I know some of you have been trained to do it differently, but I'm telling you straight up, this is what HUD says in its guidance, in writing. I mean, I read the guidance and I went, shit, that looks like it's, oh, sorry. It looks like it's been written by a lawyer. And I'm going to see if I can translate it into plain language. And this PowerPoint is the result. Okay. A landlord, I'm going to say it explicitly, cannot lawfully require a doctor's statement, cannot require that the statement be notarized or signed under penalty of perjury, and cannot require a diagnosis. Straight in. Okay. Now, having thought about all this and looked at the person, my first answer to someone who's had an interview with someone who's waiving the downloaded form about the service animal, and you're going to sit there and you're going to listen to them and you're going to ask them these questions. If they offer you the form, you're going to say, what are you going to say? Oh, no, I would never accept this in a million years. No, you're not going to say that. You're going to say, thank you so much for sharing this. Let me make a copy and I'll give it back to you. To the copier, put it in the file. And then you have a conversation and you talk to them. And then you say, well, let me just, give me the afternoon. I need to think about this. I need to put it together and make a decision. I'll get back to you shortly. And then do get back to them shortly. Think first before you answer. I know this is controversial. What? Think about an answer. I'm too busy, blah, 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 blah. But I'm going to tell you to take a deep breath and think it through because your initial reaction might not be the best one. Okay, so can we approve this? Would it cost a lot of money? Would it change things dramatically? Would it be an unbearable, impossible hassle or just a minor hassle? Because those factors are what the courts say you have to think about before you turn something down, okay? It is not a good reason to turn down a requested accommodation because everybody will want whatever it is if you approve it for one person. I cannot tell you how many people have tried that out on HUD. It does not work. And sometimes you get sued for your trouble. Okay. Or a HUD complaint. So it is a good reason to turn down a requested accommodation if that accommodation would be an undue financial and administrative hardship or a fundamental alteration of your operation. So you got to think about the questions I outlined. Is it going to cost a lot? Is it going to be a major hassle? Is it going to be a minor hassle? If it's a minor hassle, and I mean, you know, when I say major, like upheave the entire office for a week if you try to do it and completely get rid of your budget for structural changes for the next 80,000 years or more than a year, then you have to do the accommodation. And so if you could, and you have to do it and you have to say yes, and you have to say yes because as quickly as you reasonably can, at least to say, yes, we're going to do this, even if you also explain it's going to take us a minute to get a bid on this or to get this policy approved by headquarters or get the help we need to draft it or get the parking space put into place or whatever. Say yes, and then say, well, we'll need some time to accomplish it. And we'll take the steps. If you're going to say no, because it really is an undue financial and administrative hardship, it's got to be both, or it would fundamentally alter everything you do in your operations because somebody said, can you come in and give me my medication 3 times a day? And you're like, we're not certified medical trainee technicians and we can't administer medication. No, that would completely change your process. If you're going to say no, okay, you're going to say no. Say no, you say no and. So not every request for a reasonable accommodation has to be approved. It doesn't, they don't. But if a requested accommodation has to be denied because it would be an undue financial and administrative hardship or a fundamental alteration of the program, then you have to interact. You must. The courts say so. HUD says so. What's an interactive process? It is not, let's make a deal. You can't have what you wanted, but I'll give you something else that you don't want. No, that is not the way it works. It is, I give you the words. Unfortunately, I can't give you what you want, fill in the blank why, but let's talk about what I can do. It's an interaction where people talk together about what can be done to resolve a problem. Imagine. Please come into my office. Let's talk about it. That's what I think the law requires. And really, that's what kind of good manners, good customer service require. Now, okay, I'm forging right ahead. I've been talking for a few minutes. Should I look at the chat and see if there's anything I want to talk about?
Yeah, we've got some questions, Sarah.
Okay, let's take a few questions before I talk about assistive animals.
Okay. Can you talk about the 6-month rule for disability? Oftentimes individuals qualify as a person with disability and don't identify due to the stigma from the history. A person on dialysis or pregnancy are considered having a disability. I guess they're looking at temporary disabilities. Maybe that's kind of the rule.
So there's no temporary disabilities are covered by the Fair Housing Act. How long the disability might last in any rule, like a 3-month rule or a 6-month rule or a 1-year rule, is not applicable to the Fair Housing Act. And you should consider each request for an accommodation based on the circumstances of the disability and the need of the person for the accommodation. The only exception to that, I would say, if somebody wants a really expensive and hard to put together accommodation for a temporary disability, it may be outside the bounds of reasonableness, and you might want to sit down and say, I don't want to say no. What I want to do is work with you through an interactive process to see if we can get a good solution for this. That's how I would handle it.
Okay, is COVID considered a disability, especially with quarantine and symptoms and that?
So a person who has COVID or long-term effects of COVID could be considered to be a person with a disability, but it's not automatic. So the question is, at the time that they're asking for the accommodation, does their involvement with COVID substantially impair their daily activities today, or is the fact that they had COVID in the past present them as being someone with a disability today? Or are they regarded as someone with a disability? So you go back to your fundamentals and do the analysis. So it's not automatic. Somebody has COVID, oh, they're a person with disability. But if someone says, I have a heart murmur, I'm still sick, I'm still weak, I'm still tired, I need a designated parking space near my apartment because I can't walk long distances anymore. COVID is a disability, and that's a reasonable accommodation request.
But here's another one, and it's in a school context, but it comes up in housing as well. A public school asking a child with Down syndrome to provide a declaration from a doctor every year that she says she has a disability so she can receive services from the school, such as physical occupational therapy. How is this legal? Obviously, she has disabilities. In a housing context, some offices, management offices request like each year they want the person to provide new certifications or medical records. You know, if it's something that's kind of a permanent type thing, like Down syndrome, could that be required, or should it be required?
So the annual request that apartments do about certification and qualifications, including income qualifications, are required by law for continued eligibility for benefits from the government. If I had to guess, this school example is probably more or less the same way. If I were anyone dealing with this, I would answer the question once with a doctor's statement that said this disability is continuing and is not expected to improve, if I was a parent, and I would keep a copy of it. And then while they would ask for validation, if they ask for validation, because that's what their process calls, I'd haul out a copy of the letter and give it to them. That's how I would do it. And the same thing for continued reasonable accommodation. I don't think that there's a right to have, in the normal case, I don't think there's a right to have either your disability reexamined or your need for a particular accommodation to be reexamined. But there may be some cases where the nature of the accommodation or the nature of the disability suggests that people should be able to check back in and see whether the accommodation is still needed. But for school systems and housing systems that are asking about this for eligibility purposes, I'd get the letter I talked about and that says it's continuing, not expected to improve, and see if I could give them that every year.
Another question, I'm dealing with the definition of disability, so I'm holding off the assistance animal questions a little bit later till you finish going through it. But some mental health disabilities present the same as drug use. If the landlord isn't clear if the person is presenting due to a disability or drug use, can the landlord request a doctor's statement?
So first you try the conversation. Please come into my office. Let's talk about this. If after that, and having the conversation both about the disability and the accommodation, if the landlord is not sure and reasonably is not sure, one, if there's a disability, and two, if there's a need for the specific accommodation, the landlord may request backup information, but not just a doctor's statement. Any kind of reasonable documentation that addresses specifically the disability and the need for that accommodation. So there's a slide that cites a Janikowski case that's up in your neck of the woods, y'all. And it says, yeah, you can't ask for it up front, but if you've got a reasonable doubt about either the disability or the accommodation, you can ask for backup information. But that's not necessarily a doctor's statement. It is certainly not a doctor's statement signed under penalty of perjury. And HUD has been quite explicit about that in its recent guidance. So not a doctor's statement, but some follow-up documentation, yes.
Yeah, we in Michigan, we have a real adverse published Court of Appeals decision. Basically said the medical certification for an assistance animal must satisfy the expert witness rule for evidence. Its federal rule is 702, but must meet the expert witness requirement, which is a tremendous obstacle. And it's we have an appeal pending before the Supreme Court on that issue, but it kind of undercuts where HUD is and how HUD is interpreted and how you've explained it.
Yeah, that's different. That when you're talking about, providing for that kind of evidentiary standard in an ordinary daily transaction is unduly burdensome on your rights to be protected against discrimination. And I would certainly argue that it was counter to the Fair Housing Act, as I'm sure you did argue, Steve.
Yes.
That's directly inconsistent with HUD's guidance in its recent memo from a year and a half ago on assistance animals and reasonable accommodation.
Yeah, I think all the Court of Appeals and Supreme Court needs to do is just adopt the guidance and, send it back down.
Well, we can hope so.
Yeah. Can one more, and then I want you to keep going on. Can a landlord restrict the number and types of animals? I think you've kind of touched on this.
So each request so the answer is not really. The answer is for each animal, you have to have a separate discussion about a reasonable accommodation and the need for this particular animal as an accommodation. So I've seen successful cases brought where it's 2 dogs, for example, one is an older dog, second dog is in training to replace the older dog. So that is more than acceptable. And I've seen even arguments for a third in that situation where the third animal is a puppy or a cat or something that is an emotional support kind of animal. But it has to be each request has to be a separate conversation about the disability and the need for that particular animal that is disability related. And, I've seen accommodations turned down where somebody actually wanted to set up a dog breeding business as a reasonable accommodation. And there was no evidence to support that need. I'm just.
All right, thanks.
Okay, you're welcome.
Those are the main ones. I'll come back to the other questions after you go through presentation here. Thanks.
Yeah, you're welcome. This slide, moving into the discussion of assistance animals and reasonable accommodation, has a picture of a pit bull with wearing a harness that says service dog, and a picture of a really pretty golden lab with a harness that says positive. Okay, that's kind of punny. Anyway, the point about this is that dogs, assistance animals, come in different breeds, different sizes, and perform different tasks. And assistance animals are controversial and very controversial and continue to be controversial. But what I'm going to go through and fairly quickly is HUD's guidance on assistance animals, which the entire text of which is available as a long memo from HUD. This is my effort to make it more user-friendly. So accommodation protections do cover many different types of animals, different types of assistance animals. I know that assistance animals are not pets. They are animals that do work, perform tasks, assist or provide therapeutic emotional support for individuals with disabilities. So there's 2 types of assistance animals. One is a service animal, and one is another animal that do work or perform tasks or provide emotional support, sometimes referred to as support animals, and sometimes as ESAs or emotional support animals. So all of these types of animals are required to be considered as a reasonable accommodation need for a person with disability, regardless of the category. This is not like the ADA. So in the ADA, a service animal is a dog that is individually trained to do work or perform tasks. And for an individual with any kind of disability, could be sensory, could be physical, could be a guide dog, but could also be trained to retrieving a dropped item or alerting a person to a sound or reminding someone to take medication. Yes, there are animals that do that, or even pressing an elevator button. And for people with physical disabilities, among the animals that perform these kinds of tasks, there are many more than dogs. Could be a monkey, could be a particularly thoughtful cat, could be another kind of an animal. So a service animal is individually trained to provide assistance that benefits a person with a disability. And the assistance that is provided has to relate to the disability. And again, if the need for that service animal is obvious and the disability is obvious, no backup, no doctor statement, no sworn under penalty of perjury. You can see it as the disability and the need for the accommodation, and you approve it. So this is the blind person with the guide dog example. If the disability or the need for a service animal is not obvious, the landlord can have the conversation that we just talked about. Sit down, come into my office, tell me about how your disability affects what you do every day. Tell me how it affects your ability to live in your housing, and tell me why this particular accommodation is something you need, right? But if it's obvious, no documentation, no certification, no confirmation, no adverse actions except the animal, if it's a genuine service animal and it's obvious. And it's any kind of animal, again, under the Fair Housing Act, not like the ADA, where it's limited to dogs and defined in specific ways. The typical service animals, these are identifiable categories. So you should be generally familiar with them, because if someone comes in who has a mental disability and they say, I have a psychiatric service dog, you should go, oh, that's nice, honey. What does that mean? You should actually know. Or even worse, you shouldn't be dismissive and say, you've got a seizure response dog? Hell, I don't believe that. You must have just made that up. No, it is real. It's a real thing. So here's a list of categories for typical service animals. I'm going to give Steve a PDF of this material after the session is over. So if you actually need a copy of it for some unknown reason, you may request it from Steve.
It's been requested.
Okay, well,
We'll post it. We'll post it with the video of this webinar and the handout. Thank you so much.
oh, good. Thank you, Steve. Okay, so that's service animals. If the disability is obvious, need for the animal is obvious, approve it without anything else. If the disability is not obvious or the need for the service animal is not completely obvious, you start with the conversation, and then after the conversation and the genuine smiling discussion, if you're not sure, then you can ask for documentation. But it can't be just from a doctor, and it can't be sworn under penalty of perjury. And so for support animals, that's that broader second category, and they can do all kinds of things, help with depression, anxiety, and phobias. Some animals are specially trained, some are not. Although the ADA does not protect the use of a support animal, you're starting to see some evidence of that in some airplanes policies about emotional support animals and how they're supposed to be treated. ADA applies to airline travel, but the Fair Housing Act is different and applies to housing, and housing is different. Where do we spend most of our time, especially in the post-COVID era? At home. And so the Fair Housing Act has historically been interpreted somewhat more broadly and used in more ways, because we spend so much in our time in our housing, and because, truthfully, a person's home is, in fact, their castle. And we're supposed to have certain rights and abilities to use our own place in ways that the courts have been willing to protect more than they would protect in the employment environment or the airplane environment, where the public is sharing your space. So you can request a support animal. HUD says at any time, before you move in, while you're there, when the landlord discovers the support animal, which happens sometimes, support animals get smuggled in because people are afraid the management will say no. They don't know the rules, and so they bring them in. And 3 months later, 6 months later, someone's observing them out, they're with a cat in the window or a dog being walked, and go, wait, stop. This is illegal. This is trespass. You violated the rules. We're going to evict you. No. Come into my office, have a seat. Let's have a discussion about that. Even when the landlord is seeking eviction, because the animal has been discovered, because your right to a reasonable accommodation extends all the way from before your beginning of your tenancy, all the way through a threatened eviction, and even to the point of a court ruling. You're in the middle of the court process, and the court says, yeah, you're still entitled to a reasonable accommodation, and a request can be made even at the very last point, just as you're in the court proceeding. Douglas versus Krigsfield, it's a well-regarded case out of the DC Circuit, and it says that of a guy who was being evicted, not for a service animal, but essentially for hoarding behavior. And I should also say that, but for both support animals and service animals, when you're being visited by a friend or a family member has a service animal, the Fair Housing Act covers that transaction. Because remember, I said at the beginning that you're covered by the Fair Housing Act, even if the resident doesn't have a disability, but someone associated with the resident has a disability. There is protection in your housing environment for that visitor with a disability. Okay, now we get to the animals. I am not going to tell my gerbil story for you, those of you out there have heard me talk about gerbils before. But HUD says, generally speaking, reasonable accommodation should be granted for common domesticated animals. And that includes dogs, cats, gerbils, hamsters, what are some other common domesticated animals? Fish, I guess. Anyway.
Rabbits.
A rabbit, thank you. Common domesticated animals. Duck, my next door neighbor has a duck. Apparently common. Okay, but landlords cannot limit the breed or the size of a dog used as a service animal or a support animal just because the size of the breed or the breed. So you can't say no Rottweilers, no pit bulls, and no yappy dogs. Can't say all dogs allowed under 20 pounds, and if it's over 20 pounds, we're going to not let you have that dog. The service animal or the support animal is the size, breed, and the breed that is most useful to the person with disabilities. You can't limit on that basis. And before you ask the question, if your local community has a rule against Rottweilers or something, then the landlord should collaborate with the resident to request a reasonable accommodation based on disability from the community or the municipality. Of course, landlords can limit any particular animal because their conduct is bad, because they bit somebody, because they have not been vaccinated, okay? Because they are not complying with the local rules, or they cannot refuse a particular breed or size because of some assumption about the size of the animal or the behavior of that particular breed.
Sarah, we had a question came up. There's a number of universities that are requiring that any support animal be 12 months or older, 1 year and above.
So step one, the reasonable accommodation provisions of the Fair Housing Act do apply to dormitory life. See United States versus University of Nebraska at Kearney, which is an emotional support animal against a university that concludes, brought by the U.S. Department of Justice, concluding that a dorm is a dwelling covered by the Fair Housing Act and saying that the Fair Housing Act's reasonable accommodation requirements apply. A rule that says you're not going to accept an animal under 12 months, the way I would address that is I would say two things. One, in a particular setting, a particular animal who is under 12 months may be the animal that is required as a reasonable accommodation because of a person's particular disability. So come into my office, let's have the conversation. I think the second question is a little bit harder, which is, can someone have a general policy that the animals have to be younger based on some perceived evidence based on how young animals behave, like do they, defecate or urinate in unexpected and inappropriate areas because they're so young. I think that the answer to that is that at the very least, such a policy has to be justified by concrete evidence, not just something that somebody made up. And secondly, that policy there must be a reasonable exception to that policy when it's needed by a particular person with a disability who needs a particular animal under the age of 12 months as a reasonable accommodation. So it's like it's either that the policy has too much of an impact, depending on the evidence, or that there has to be an exception to that policy for a particular person with a particular disability. So
Yeah, it's written right into the policies by the university. It's in writing. No support animals or no assistance animals. I think it covers service animals, but basically, no animals under 1 year of age.
So if it's tied to the disability of the people who would use the support animal or the service animal, like in the bigger section of the policy, I would say that that policy in and of itself violates the Fair Housing Act and could be challenged as an unlawful condition on a reasonable accommodation.
Okay.
It's a condition, right? You can say it discriminates in general, but it doesn't discriminate against everybody with the service animal, but it conditions a needed accommodation by something relating to the age of the animal and it strikes potentially too broadly. I think there's a lot of places where HUD says that you can't condition a requested accommodation. You can't condition a requested accommodation on paying a fee, like you can't charge a pet deposit. You can't condition an accommodation on paying $350 for a designated parking space. You cannot condition an accommodation on having a particular color or provided or getting a particular kind of contractor to deal with it, right? Okay,
Yeah.
back to the subject, what kind of animal? If you want a unique animal, if you're going for an ostrich, or your tenant is, or a gorilla, or a kangaroo, or a snake, or whatever else, HUD has been clear that a request to have that kind of unique animal requires a much stronger showing that there is a disability-related need for the animal. I personally have never seen a case involving a python where I felt that there was a disability-related need for a python. Disability-related need for something, maybe, but not for the python. But, you know, we all have our own biases, and the question is not bringing our own biases into play. It is looking for the evidence in the situation, the particular situation, about what is the disability of the individual and why is it that they need this particular accommodation with, in this case, this particular kind of animal. And again, a unique animal, you got to have more. And this might actually breach the line between having an actual doctor statement or psychiatrist statement about the specific disability-based need for this unusual animal where the relationship between disability and that animal is not clear nor intuitive. Okay, heading on. So, okay, the online certification forms and registration forms, hugely controversial. Everybody's got an opinion about them. I'm going to say, I don't think they do benefit to the person with the disability or the landlord. It's just a piece of paper based on data that someone fills out on an online setting. And even if they say it's signed off on by someone who is technically proficient in the information, it's still based on a history. And HUD has said it is not reliable. So my answer is, when someone comes in and brings you one of these as a landlord, you do exactly what I say. Let me make a copy. I'll give it right back to you. Here, I'll put it in your file. Thank you so much. Please have a seat. Let's talk. If you're a person with a disability, I have to say you shouldn't need one. So, and that is because a landlord is not entitled to ask for additional documentation if the disability and the need for the accommodation is obvious. And if it's not obvious, HUD says this online certifications, in their opinion, is not enough to support a claim that someone has a disability covered by the law or someone needs a reasonable accommodation. They're looking for somebody with personal knowledge. Even if it's just to see the person, take a history, ask them a few questions and sign off. That feels to HUD much more reliable than some online form. And I really don't know that I disagree with them. I just don't think they do a benefit for anybody. Insurance. It comes up as a defense. The landlord says, my insurance company told me that I couldn't have Rottweilers or pit bulls on the property because they present a risk. So after investigation, number one, sometimes those statements are lies. Just put it boldly. That's not what their policy says. It says nothing about it. But so investigators go and get a copy of the policy. And if you're talking to someone, you're a person with a disability, right, may I see your policy? Good job. Okay, you look at the policy. Can you show me where that's covered? Well, because none of us want to read insurance policies unless we absolutely have to. So can you show me where that's covered? Oh, well, yeah, maybe I ought to rethink my decision on this. I can't find it right now, So, but if the policy actually says certain breeds are prohibited, then there is that the insurance company is subject to a complaint against the insurance company, and the landlord can file that complaint, and can the tenant. And if they're really collaborating, they can do it together. Because an insurance company who has such a policy, in my experience, and I've seen a lot of emotional support in other animal cases, the insurance company likely does not have viable evidence to establish a risk based on that breed at that location, because that data is usually not maintained. It's based on some stereotype or assumption about Rottweilers or pit bulls or yappy dogs or whatever it is. So no, not going to work. I've never seen an insurance company have such a policy where it has been supported by viable evidence. If there is viable evidence, then that's a different question, because then you're dealing with a health and safety issue. But it is unlikely that a breed-wide policy would be upheld in any case. It would almost have to be, a very high percentage of risk for those animals. And in real time, it's sort of like the animals are subject to stereotyping. If one pit bull bites someone, then every other pit bull must be a problem. Well, some pit bulls are a problem. Some Rottweilers are a problem. Some Chihuahuas are a problem. And even some lovely labs are a problem. But that's based on the individual dog, not based on the breed. Okay, fees. Fair Housing Act is interpreted by HUD and by courts to say that you can't charge a fee or a deposit or another charge for an assistance animal of any type, service animal, companion animal, or any other reasonable accommodation. You can charge if you have a tenant with a disability that has an assistive animal and there's damage, or there's any other kind of damage that is related to disability related issues. It is true that a landlord can charge for damage caused by the animal or by the person with a disability, even if the damage is caused by the disability, because it is damage, it's concrete damage, and it is just like any other injury to a rental property. But charging a fee for any reasonable accommodation is the burden on the right to have a reasonable accommodation. It is prohibited. And there is a couple of cases. There's one that I always say is a textbook case where the landlord charged a fee for an application for a reasonable accommodation, had each application and required a sworn doctor's statement in support of the accommodation, which is acts as a fee for someone who doesn't have any money or doesn't have a lot of money, who has to go pay a doctor to do the sworn statement when the disability related need would have been clear. Someone had had a conversation. Then the lawyer for the company required a personal interview with the tenant and grilled them. That wasn't a fee, but it was certainly burdensome if you had to take time off work, could have been a cost factor. And then charged you an additional fee if they did approve the accommodation, and finally required a pet fee. So, that's like a textbook case of how many fees how we can turn a requested reasonable accommodation into a profit center. I'll tell you about a case in a minute that is another such case that we're litigating right now. Okay, so here's some typical cases, recent ones. So this is not something that's, old and dead and whatever. HUD has routinely been charging a number of service animal, assistive animal cases over the last several years. In fact, sometimes some of us wondered if that was the only kind of case HUD was investigating. I'm sure it wasn't. But here's one. HUD issued a charge against a landlord in Pennsylvania for having a policy that only allowed trained service animals, but not support animals. They were following the ADA rules. Wrong. Fair Housing Act rules. 2021, HUD issued a charge against the landlord for charging a pet deposit for an assistance animal. Again, the landlord said she looked up the rule and it applied only to people who are blind or deaf or had another disability. Well, this is someone who had an emotional support animal, and the landlord just decided that that wasn't covered. And she had a psychiatrist letter confirming her need for the disability. Charged for charging a monthly pet fee and cleaning charge and a pet security deposit for an emotional support animal, unlawful charge. Okay, so those are some typical examples of enforcement. I'm not going to stop here because I want to cover a few more things, but I'll stop in a few minutes to see if there are any further questions about emotional support animals or service animals or assistive animals or any other things I've talked about. I want to talk about other kinds of other forms of disability discrimination briefly, because it's not just assistive animals, although, again, we hear a lot about those. Here's some discriminatory occupancy and eligibility policies. Rule that you must be capable of living independently has been unlawful since a court decision in New York. I think in the early 1980s, but it still pops up sometimes. Sometimes it's in assisted living. More likely it comes in a case where an apartment complex tries to evict someone because they conclude, usually without medical evidence, that the person is no longer capable of living independently. The issue of having a live-in aid or requiring extra charges for attendance or for aides. Those have been such common reasonable accommodations that HUD in its regulations, its program regulations, explain that it is an appropriate reasonable accommodation to go up a bedroom size to accommodate a live-in attendant. And even have rules about how the living attendant is treated. They are not to be put on the lease, for example. Their qualifications are not to be considered as in the eligibility determination as to the head of household. We've seen it as eviction decisions if someone has certain conditions, like dying of cancer. In nursing homes and in other places, requirements that residents transfer from a wheelchair into a dining room chair, as in the way in which it barred someone who is not capable of transferring from even eating in the dining room. So kind of unequal treatment. Limitations on wheelchair use, even in assisted living properties where you're not allowed to use a wheelchair or only allowed to use certain kinds of wheelchairs that limit your mobility. Requiring special deposits or liability insurance for an accommodation or a modification. Like, oh, you want to put in a ramp? Fine, but you have to provide liability insurance for the ramp for anybody who gets hurt on it. No, not allowed. Failure to provide accessible transit. This is the recent case where a property had a shuttle van that they used to take its residents to the mall and bingo and out for events, excursions, and it was not accessible. And so all the residents who wanted to go out but used a wheelchair could not be served. And the court said that's unequal treatment. Restricting residents with wheelchairs to the first floor, also a problem. Transfers for first floor units or larger units because of disability. And there's a recent case that even says a failure to keep an elevator in good repair can be an act of discrimination towards people with disabilities. The elevator issue has gone both ways in courts, but the more recent and better ruling is if you've got an elevator problem, you can't just end up having no elevator and having people trapped in their units. So if people are going to be trapped, it's a fire safety problem, it's a health and safety issue, it's a restriction on their ability to move about the property, and it's dangerous as all get out. So if your elevators are both out of commission, you need to make reasonable accommodation exceptions to the idea that you just got to use the steps because some people can't use the steps. And you should have a fire safety plan and the option to have people stay someplace else, such as in a hotel, while the elevators are being repaired. I tell you this because I know a housing authority that had no alternative, no health safety plan for elevator problems. And that property, which was a mid-rise and had 2 elevators, one of the elevators was out of a commission. And then in the second one, there was a fire. There was a fire in the building. And the people with disabilities on the higher floors had no way of getting out. The elevator was dysfunctional, and there was no plan for getting those residents out of the building in case of a fire. One resident died. Don't do that. Have a plan and have a process if your elevator is really out of commission. This is true with some older properties. Here's a few more accommodations. Late rent payments. If you're a person with a disability or a landlord with a tenant who's chronically late on rent, in general, you should try to figure out what's going on. I mean, sometimes people don't pay rent because they don't have the money, but sometimes there's something else going on. That's just a conversation. But if the root cause is that the Social Security disability check comes on the second Wednesday of the month, an alternative payment date can be a reasonable accommodation. And there is case law, Fair Housing Rights Center versus Morgan Properties Management Company, case litigated by my law firm recently in Pennsylvania, saying that you have to make an accommodation to have the alternative payment date. Landlords can make disability-based accommodations for the cause of non-payment of rent is COVID related. And they can work together and should work together to provide housing assistance through the CARES Act or the American Rescue Plan or other sources. This is a hot issue right now and an important one. Landlords who refuse to fill out the forms or to accept payments from readily available federal funds are subject to civil rights law enforcement and other kinds of actions as well, but because of their actions. So if you have questions about that, you can ask me about that in a few minutes. And landlords, while we're still under stay close to home, and in some states, more restrictive COVID-based restrictions, think about a repayment plan, a reasonable repayment plan instead of eviction, because of the risk to residents and even to the people and other people in the property if someone has to go out and about and try to look for another place to live because they're going to be evicted. So, almost today's news. Here's a property in New York that's being sued by my law firm. It's operating in 5 different states, including Ohio and Pennsylvania. It's called Clover Properties. And we're suing them over a couple of issues. We have an accessible parking place and a designated parking space issue, allegations in our complaint. And we also have allegations that charging an extra upcharge, a higher fee for units on the first floor of the property and units near the elevator, charging more monthly rent for those units operates as a surcharge that denies people with disabilities their rights. And so here's an excerpt from a press release that was issued on this case when it was filed earlier this year. So these kinds of issues, I think in this case, the property really was not aware of Fair Housing Act requirements at all and considered these fees as being a profit generating, income generating technique, sort of like amenity pricing. But we're challenging that on the basis that it disproportionately impacts people with disabilities and denies them a reasonable accommodation exception to the higher rent in their amenity pricing scheme. Okay. So I'll take just 5 minutes to talk about reasonable modifications, which are the structural changes that are needed to make a condo or an apartment or other, even single family housing more accessible and usable. So you've already heard about the general concept of requirements for building a place from the beginning to be compliant with the Fair Housing Act's design and construction requirements. But sometimes the property is older and does not have features, and sometimes even under the Fair Housing Act, it doesn't have some of the features that a person with a disability might need to be successful in their housing. For example, might not have grab bars in the shower. that might be needed, or may not have a bench in the shower, or might have an older clubhouse or office that has a ramp, or that has steps and is not accessible to people with disabilities. So reasonable modifications under the Fair Housing Act are really applicable to market rate properties, especially older properties, or even newer properties that lack some of the features a particular person might need. Accommodations are limited to policies and practices, modifications and structural changes. So the elements of that sort of is, well, did someone ask for it or they just do it? Okay. Did someone related to the request have a disability, whether it was a visitor or a resident? Did the landlord know about the tenant's disability? And the landlord or other housing provider either refused to permit the modification or put conditions on the modification. So the rule for modifications is different for accommodate than it is for accommodation. Generally speaking, the burden is on the landlord for a reasonable modification in the regulations and in the law to approve the modifications, assuming that they're requested, they're needed by a person with disabilities to benefit from the housing. And the tenant pays for them and provides them, right? So the kind of unlawful conditions we sometimes see on these, first of all, you have to provide insurance to cover an exterior ramp. Well, no, you don't, because once the ramp is installed, it becomes a fixture, use a legal term. It's attached to the property, becomes the owner's responsibility to maintain it and to have it covered by its insurance. Painting the ramp a particular color or making it out of a particular type of material, homeowners associations on steroids. Yes, you may have this ramp, but we wanted an architect to design it. It must be made of brick. It must be a guardrail, have a black guardrail around it. It must have a gate. It must be built out of, concrete. Those kinds of specific requirements from a homeowners association are unlawful and subject to the Fair Housing Act. We generally say that if a homeowners association wants a particular color, a particular type of construction, they are welcome to work with the tenant to design and construct the ramp to the tenant's specifications, but they can't put in something that's that they want that doesn't meet the tenant's needs. So aesthetics is not a defense to a reasonable modification case. There's some basic rules here, which I would describe in short as being: one, somebody can make any modifications they want to the inside of their condo or single family home that they own without anybody doing anything about it, because it's just like a remodel, basically. Secondly, if they want to make a change to the exterior, they may have to provide a reasonable description of the modifications and some reasonable assurance the work will be done in a workmanlike manner and that any required building permits may be obtained. So the landlord may request a reasonable description of the modification if someone asks about it, but if it's not requested, you don't have to go and ask permission. The landlord may request an assurance that the work will be done in a workmanlike way and that the building permits will be obtained, and there's no interactive process. So this is specifically for people with disabilities. If you're thinking about an external modification to a rental property, one, you should go talk to your landlord. Come on, be nice, right? You don't have to, but you should. And you should let the landlord what you intend and why you need to do it. Landlords, you can't say no. You can say, I would like a written description. I would like a little plan or a picture of what you intend to do. I would like you to tell me how it's going to be done and who's going to do it and whether or not permits are going to be required. Don't forget, you got to have a permit. If you have to have a permit, you need to get it. That's what landlords can be talking about. It's not an interactive process. Landlord must permit, may ask for other specific assurances, can't charge money for it, can't require insurance, can't require bricks and green or whatever. Modifications, what about taking them out? Well, if you read the law really carefully, which a lot of people don't do, you don't have to require removal of a modification One, if it's a condo, no requirement to remove a modification on the interior of the unit because the person that owns the property, they're making the change. It's on them if it affects resale value. And if there is a modification on the outside in a condo, they become the responsibility of the HOA, and the HOA decides if they want to remove it or not. If it's a tenant can only be required to remove modifications on the inside of the unit that interfere with the ability of the landlord or another tenant to use the unit. If that kind of modification is going to be made on the inside of the unit, like one example somebody gave me in the context, I think it worked, lowering the countertop in the kitchen down to a low level so somebody working from a wheelchair could work at that countertop. And because there was limited space, lowering that particular part of the countertop really did affect the ability of somebody else to use the unit. If that's what's being requested, the landlord could ask you for a deposit against returning that countertop to its original state. And that deposit has to be held in escrow, has to be reasonable, has to be repaid when the tenant restores the modification, or if they skip out, you use it to restore the modification. And again, any modification on the outside of either a condo or of an apartment building, the law does not permit the landlord or the HOA to require people to remove things that they have added to the exterior of the dwelling. That's on them. If they want to take it down, I guess they can, as long as they restore it after the person moves out, but there's no requirement on the resident to remove anything in the common area because it becomes part of the common area. And here's a few arguments against modifications that courts and HUD have rejected. The ramp would interfere with traffic. This was a defense in a HUD ALJ case. Judge looked at it and said, no, it wouldn't. It would work fine. A ramp would be inconsistent with aesthetics, that is ugly. No, courts don't accept aesthetics as a defense, and there's explicit judicial rulings that say so. We don't want you to do this. We want you to do this, 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 and this, which would cost a lot more, but we want it to be green and made out of brick. And you do not get an interactive process with a modification. If for some reason the requested modification is unreasonable, like it's throwing down a slab of plywood, it would not be workmanlike, you can say no to that. They have to come back with a different option, again, that they're paying for or someone else is paying for on their behalf. I'll remove you instead of letting you modify the property. No, that's not acceptable from a landlord. And or require a specific form or make that the request be made at a particular time. No, not permitted. There's a few more distinct requirements for under the ADA, but what I really want to make you aware of is sometimes either an accommodation or a modification requires interaction with the municipal government. This has come up, people have called me about this several times recently. So a lot of times it's something like I have an apartment building and there's no more space for a handicap parking space. But I need a handicap parking space on the street. I still need one, but you don't have any space for it. I need a handicap parking space on the street and you have to work with the city to get one put in there. In best circumstances, that's the landlord and the tenant working together, but it's somebody going to the city and asking them as a reasonable accommodation to provide the accessible parking space there.
Yeah, that came up in one of the questions, and to make it clear, you may have to go through the process with the municipality to make that request.
That's right. It might be a separate reasonable accommodation request under the ADA Title II and under the Fair Housing Act, because municipalities are covered by ADA Title II, and they have a comparable sort of reasonable accommodation process in ADA Title II. So if you need some, like a guy I spoke to at a training I did 2 weeks ago, used a wheelchair, said his driveway was too steep for his wheelchair to accommodate, and he didn't have enough parking space at the top to open up his van. So he asked the municipality for a parking space on the street at the bottom of the hill at his place. And they were still pending the decision on that. And I said, well, it's an ADA and the Fair Housing Act claim against the municipality if they don't address that concern. Yeah. All right, Steve, how are we doing on questions or comments from anybody?
They've been coming in. Are you ready?
Well,
Wrap-
I think I'm ready for any comments or questions that anybody has.
Okay, I think you kind of answered this one. Have you seen any challenges to psychiatric service dogs?
Yes, I have often. Well, psychiatric assistance animals, yes. Psychiatric service animals, not many, a couple I've heard about. And mostly they come up in investigations by fair housing groups that are unfamiliar with the concept and need a little bit of talking so that they understand it to be a good advocate, but they do occur sometimes. I've heard hearing assistance dogs also as a kind of an unusual category, but I have seen those in apartments, especially where the dog is trained to bark when the doorbell rings or when the phone rings.
Yeah, are emotional dogs, I guess emotional support animals, covered under the same rights as a trained service dog?
Not exactly the same rights. There's often more questions about the disability-related needs for those animals, and the number of the animals for assistive animals or service animals. I would say service animals have slightly more protection in HUD's view, that if the disability is obvious, the need for the animal is obvious, no documentation, you just accept the dog. You don't have to sit down and have a conversation. So I would say service animals of the various types we talked about in the training have more protections than other forms of assistive animals, because there's more of a process you go through with the assistive animals.
And I got a couple of questions about the housing provider assessment of damages and charges. Two questions. Tenant use a wheelchair during inspection. There are noticeable damages to the carpet, and there's a request to the tenant to repair. They're not moving out, and the wheelchair is likely to cause damage to the new carpet. And the other one, can the landlord charge your security deposit after you move out for routine wheelchair damage?
Yeah. So those are interesting questions. The first thing is, what I would do is, one, if I were going to be ready to share properties usually have a schedule on which they change carpet. If it's time to change the carpet, you change the carpet in the unit that is occupied by a resident in a wheelchair, just like you would change the carpet anywhere. In general, it's sometimes said that inexpensive carpet and with inadequate padding is much more likely to have wheelchair damage than better brands of carpets. But I'd leave that to the property to decide whether they want to do a little bit more advanced protection by putting in more resilient carpet and a better pad if they actually are replacing carpet. If someone has the damage now, you can't charge them for the damage now. You can talk to them about it, but if they move out, they may be subject to damage that is caused by the use of someone in a wheelchair that is beyond the kind of routine damage you would expect by that person living in that unit. So you would expect there to be some damage, maybe to the carpet and maybe some damage to the walls, but something that is excessive, big dings, big scrapes in the walls, carpet torn. I would think that would be where the security deposit would be applied for corrective action. So I don't think you can use the security deposit or charge the tenant during tenancy for replacing carpet that just have tracks in it or lines in it where the wheelchair has gone through it. But if the damage is more severe than that, then that's when you're talking about using the deposit to pay for it or to have extra charges if that's what's necessary. But it has to be something more than ordinary wear and tear. HUD's regulations on modifications in general say you can't charge a fee when someone leaves for something that is just ordinary wear and tear. And ordinary wear and tear includes ordinary wear and tear by someone who uses a wheelchair or is blind.
Right. Landlords in Detroit require a monthly fee for allowed pets. I think you kind of discussed that.
That would be unlawful. If the animal that is needed and that lives in the unit is either a service animal or a support animal or some form of an assistive animal.
If it's not some type of assistance animal, then they can charge it.
If it is not an assistance animal, they can charge the fee. If it is an assistance animal needed by someone with a disability, they should not charge the fee.
And can they put people with assistance animals in like a pet building or pet unit or something like that? Certain part of a complex?
This is a question I've never heard before, so congratulations. But I think the answer to that is that in the same way that you can, putting all the pets in one building is not unlawful per se, but to the extent that it segregates people from with disabilities and separates them from people without disabilities, it would be a policy that has a disproportionate impact on people with disabilities. And it might actually be intentional depending on how it was worded.
Yeah, I think they call it like a pet
All
building.
people with disabilities, if it says the policy is all people with disabilities must live in this building, all people with disabilities and service animals or assistive animals must live in this building, then it's, if you have someone who objects to it, then I would challenge it as a policy that has a disproportionate impact based on disability.
I've got a few more questions, but I don't know if you're finished with what you wanted to present. Do you have
Yeah,
more?
I'm finished. I'm finished with what I wanted to present.
Oh, good. Well, here we go. Rapid fire, okay?
Okay.
What if the disability is connected to a health hazard eviction case? For example, hoarding. Is there a way to create an accommodation that would keep the individual in the unit?
Yes, there definitely is, and there's case law on the point. So hoarding, if hoarding is an identified issue, and we know it is, it shows up in fair housing cases with some frequency, not all the time, but sometimes. It's an identified disability, psychiatric in nature, usually, although sometimes can occur with persons with physical disabilities that prevent them from keeping the apartment clean or with taking out the trash and so forth. So if it's identified during tenancy, it should be addressed during tenancy prior to eviction. And it should be, you have accommodations that are available in various ways. So a typical one, and one that was upheld by a court many years ago, was in a particular situation, the person just needed assistance in taking out the trash, and they would fill the trash can. And the reasonable accommodation was the maintenance guy came by twice a week and picked it up and took it to the dumpster. So it can be as narrowly tailored a situation as that. In other situations where there is resistance to doing anything like that, in order to prevent eviction, the way you set it up is to say, this has to happen and you have 30 days to make it happen. So you allow the person with the disability a chance to identify, perhaps through a case manager, a social service organization or other group, the opportunity to find an organization that would come in and assist, right? If that's not taken by the tenant, then my advice to the landlord is to offer such assistance as a reasonable accommodation on a one-time only basis to prevent eviction. And if that is not successful, you could proceed with eviction, but if the party gets represented for the first time during eviction, Douglas versus Krigsfield says, you still got to grant the accommodation if you're the landlord, even if you're at court on an eviction hearing. The right to have that reasonable accommodation applies all the way up to the eviction process. So it's smarter for the landlord to try to make the accommodation in advance if the person is willing.
Are there cases where landlords can be required to provide 2 egresses for everyone except the wheelchair user who only has one? I think we had Ed Rosenson's case, which I think the district court said it could require 2, like accessible routes.
Yeah. Yeah.
Amber said 1. I think, isn't that the general rule throughout the country is 1, correct?
No, the general rule is 2.
Okay.
I mean, I've seen it in building codes over and over again, whether something could be treated as a bedroom, you have to have 2 means of egress. One is usually the door, and the second one is usually a window of a certain dimension. I've never seen it applied in an accessible route context, but I guess I don't think that surprises me.
Sarah, someone asked, can you discuss just generally, I guess, possible liability for landlords refusing to accept COVID relief funds?
Well, I talked about it a little bit a few minutes ago, but I'm going to say that you are messing with fire. Everybody in the world is about COVID relief funds, accepting COVID relief funds, saving tenants whose lives have been adversely affected by COVID. A landlord's refusal to accept COVID relief funds or to take whatever the necessary steps are to apply for them or to assist the tenant to apply for them is making yourself very, very, very much likely a target for litigation. I've heard about this in several cases. I've provided consultation to people in various states where the landlords are just, no, this is federal money. I'm not going to take federal money. That kind of hidebound kind of resistance. And I'll say, if there's a disability related circumstance, for sure, you'll have a disability related case for refusing to accept rental assistance, where the result of your actions is likely to put somebody with a disability out on the streets, which, a judge is not gonna particularly be fond of. But I think if the issue is presented to a judge is going to say, why the hell didn't you take this money, which would have paid for all the back rent and kept the person in the unit? And I'd be with the judge on that.
Yeah. These are a couple somewhat on a little bit. Oh no, I'll do one more disability question and a couple other ones. There's a question. I have a physical disability. I struggle with getting up and down the porch, inside, and the basement steps. Where and who can I speak with or apply for accommodations? And is there some funding for this?
Yeah. So I can't tell from that question whether it's a single family house or an apartment, but the places that I have seen most likely get assistance, and others can step in the chat and add other places, but Voc Rehab has provided assistance to me in making a place that I lived more accessible so that my husband could get to work back in the day. I think social service agencies, centers for independent living are places that may have funding. We've settled a number of accessibility cases in your area in Ohio and Indiana, particularly. I don't know where you come from, with accessibility funds to make reasonable to make reasonable modifications to increase accessibility for apartments and single family homes. And sometimes even a city has a ramp building program or similar opportunities that can at least help you get in and out of the property easily and more accessibly with a ramp, possibly with a handrail. As for basement steps, that's a harder problem. And I think somebody would have to take a look at it to see whether it's possible to make it more usable for you.
Yeah, we have a Detroit Guide to Home Repair, which was numerous resources as well. I don't know if this question came from Detroit or not. And then here's a couple different ones. Can a landlord rent to people only if they are married, and say that if not married, they're not allowed to have overnight guests if not married? We have marital status under our state law.
Oh, no. You should be talking to Steve's group if you're in Detroit, and I'm talking to a fair housing organization if you live somewhere other than the Detroit area.
Yeah, and let me see, a couple more. What if the carpet wear from the wheelchair is to the degree that it purportedly caused a REAC violation, REAC violation?
Then if I'm the landlord, I'm going to fix the REAC violation, and I'm not going to charge the resident for it. Come on.
Yeah.
REAC is a program that HUD uses to supposedly assess the performance of project-based Section 8 programs. I'm in the process of evaluating a case against a big developer that runs PBRA properties because of their failure to maintain and keep the property up. So just saying, fix your REAC violations and do more that you can to make things better for the tenants. That's not.
What about costs associated with the zoning variance process? Are they legal under the Fair Housing Act? That's a good one.
Somebody I know asking that question. That's pretty specific, Megan. Oh, sorry, I don't, maybe it's not a specific question. So that might be Rachel. Anyway, the answer to the question is no. There are some zoning processes where for variances, for example, there's a special application fee in processes, and sometimes in other kinds of variances, there are fees associated with people getting an exception for group homes. And if the process that is being used is an equivalent to a reasonable accommodation process needed because of the disabilities of the resident of the single family property or the group home, then the accommodation process should not come with a fee. Just like charging a fee for other kinds of reasonable accommodations. That is inappropriate.
And here's one from Amber. It's a design question. Covered multifamily dwelling for, yeah, well, not, I wonder what her last name is. Covered multifamily dwelling unit constructed in 1992 with an elevator. The property is for sale. Elevator is almost 30 years old and consistently breaking down. Prospective purchaser wishes to disservice the elevator rather than bear the expense of a new one. If they disservice the elevator, are they at risk for a design violation, not maintaining accessible features, for eliminating the accessible route to all the covered units in the elevator serves?
You know, I'm in litigation right now. I can think of 18 reasons why I would sue someone who did that, including the fire marshal is never going to let you disservice that elevator. Let's not get to the accessibility question. First, let's get to the health and safety question. The fire marshal is not going to allow you to take that elevator out of service if people are living on second, third, and fourth floors, because that would violate the fire code. People won't be able to get out. But as for the accessibility question, I will say that if the elevator is part of the required accessible route, which in a covered Fair Housing Act property, if the elevator is part of that, then by deservicing the elevator, you have eliminated the required accessible route and you have violated the Fair Housing Act design and construction requirements, as well as putting the life, health, and safety of residents on the second floor and above at risk. Don't do it, y'all.
Let me see a couple more. Sarah, I think people will draw on your knowledge all day long, if we could.
Well, that's okay. The PowerPoint has my email address. It's spratt@relmanlaw.com. Half of you are already talking to me already. But if you've got a specific question, if you want consultation, or if you need representation or explanation because you're a landlord and need additional help, you can email me. I try to respond to my inquiries in a reasonable amount of time.
Well, thank you so much. Really appreciate it. Appreciate you coming and presenting. I think it was extremely informative. I think it's going to be well received. We'll appreciate it.
Great. So happy to be here. Nice to be a part of your actions here, and look forward to working with you.
Thank you so much. Appreciate it. Thanks so much for coming. All right, let me share a couple things to wrap up. Thank you, everybody, for staying on. I know it's been a little bit of time here. Real quick, we have, oh, sorry, go to the next one here. In the chat, or you can put it in the Q&A, either way. It's real important for us to know in terms of future planning. What else would you like to know about? What other fair housing, other type issues that you think would be helpful? Other training topics that would be important to you? I know that there's a program coming up November 5th, University of Michigan and Southwest Solutions are sponsoring a program focused on access to affordable single-family housing in Detroit. They have program data. They looked at HMDA census, city assessor, and MISTA data to create layered maps of housing activity within the city of Detroit. People are welcome to attend. That's going to be November 5th, starting at 9 o'clock. And it's at U of M, Michigan Detroit Center on Woodward, 3663 Woodward Avenue. So that deals with getting people into affordable homes. It deals with mortgage lending, those types of issues, MISTA programs. Real important looking at the data and seeing areas of Detroit that have not been fully served. But that's my suggestion. I think encourage you to attend it. But are there other topics that you would like to have available? Again, Sarah's PowerPoint will be made available. She's going to send it to in a PDF format. I will post it on our website. We also have the prior program is on our website, the program we had in April. But I want to know, please, I know it's late in the day from people have to get on with many of their works. But yeah, please put, keep those comments coming in the chat in terms of future topics, training topics that would be important to you. Just to wrap up real quick, again, this conference will be posted on fairhousingdetroit.org under services and resources. the video of our April 21st conference on the use of criminal records, expungements, habitability. That's available on our website. For example, there's a link where you can contact, you can email the NAACP Detroit. They will assist free of charge people needing assistance with the expungement process. So it has a lot of other very, very helpful resources. I really encourage you to go to our website and have that information that will be there to assist you. Our next conference, we're setting it for just a month from now, Thursday, November 30th. We're going to deal with landlord tenant and fair housing training for small landlords. That's a community that's really not often served in terms of fair housing training, landlord tenant training. A lot of it has to do with, the training has to do with management companies, property owners, maybe even individuals. But the small landlords that have 1, 2, 3 properties tend to not receive a lot of training and be able to have their questions answered. And we would like to do that November 30th. So look for that. If you know somebody that would be interested in that type of a training, please have them go on our website, sign up for the training. And again, it's going to be offered free of charge. This is not because the training isn't very good. We've had, some of the nation's leading experts. Just because it's free doesn't mean it's not good. It is good, believe me. We just have had funds from Detroit, the HRD department. Julie, Warren Duncan, Marlene Robinson, and others have been a great support for this. So thank Detroit's HRD program for the funding to provide it. Again, it's first-rate training, but to offer it free of charge, they're trying to make it accessible for everybody. Real quick, if you have any questions, again, our services are listed. We do fair housing complaints, intake investigation. We have testing. There's an opportunity for people to sign up to be trained to become a tester. We also do enforcement proceedings and resolution. All our complaint services and that are provided free of charge. And we also answer other kind of fair housing questions. We provide a great deal of training and education. That goes for anybody who wants training. Contact us and you'll receive it. Our telephone number is 579-FAIR, area code 313-579-FAIR. You can also contact us online at fairhousingdetroit.org. Again, the website for the training will be on the same website, fairhousingdetroit.org. If you just type in Fair Housing Detroit, we should pop up. I want to thank everyone for participating. Really appreciate it. And again, everything I would say will be posted by probably Monday. No later. I'm going to put a deadline of no later than Monday. The presentations that you heard today will be posted and be available for you to review at your leisure. I want to thank you so much. If you have other questions and comments, you can write us at info@fairhousingdetroit.org or go to our website and it'll have the contact information as well. I'll save the chat in terms of topics that you would like us to cover, and then we'll be working on getting those presentations targeted to the topics that you would like to receive information on. Thank you all so much for participating and joining in it. And I really appreciate the fact that so many people stayed on, even when we ran a little bit over. But I wish you all the best. And again, anything that we can do to provide assistance to you, please do not hesitate to contact us. Thank you so much, everybody. Take care. Bye-bye. Bye-bye, everybody.